Morena koutou, me nui kia koutou I hui I tēnei rā. Welcome to this Environment, Science and Policy Workshop on the Clause 4 feedback. This is an open session. This session will be recorded and put on the website later on. And here we go. The draft land and water plan continues to progress through the statutory period. Today's workshop is to go over the Clause 4 feedback provided by iwi and how staff intend to respond to that feedback with any alterations to the plan. The goal of this workshop is to ensure councillors understand the feedback and how it has been applied to the development of the plan. It's not to litigate the contents of the plan. Before we start, me nui atu kia mana whenua iwi for their considerable time and effort committed to the development of the plan from its inception and now for their final comments. We do not always agree, but we always agree, consider and respect the position of iwi in our partnership. We'd also like to thank the staff for presenting the information in a clear and concise way. There's basically 8 key areas, focus areas that have been broken down for our discussions, and our staff will run through them one at a time for us. So I'd just like to thank the staff for, I know they've been working really hard and behind the scenes, and they've got a good clear report for us to go through here today. We've got a full lineup of staff, which they'll be coming and going as the day proceeds. So we'll just introduce them as they come. Or I think we're pretty sure we'll all be familiar with all the staff that are involved. So thank you for being here. And like previous workshops, we need to keep within the scope of the paper, but we need to feel free to ask questions and all be involved in the discussion around the topics within the paper. We need to respect each other at all times. So thank you very much. Andrew?
Thanks, Lord. Hey, I just want to relate to a comment I made yesterday during a discussion draft land plan. It was an inappropriate comment related to Robin's copy of the Clause 4 hard copy, and I hope if I caused any angst or grief to staff, I apologise for that. It certainly wasn't intentional, but it was a loose comment that I shouldn't have made. So, cheers.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Kate?
So before we get into this, I just wanted to check if I can. We've got a document that I think has been completely prepared by staff, but I may be wrong because it's headed ORC staff recommendations. In the part A, and you've got this is strategic direction here. The concern, is that iwi words or is that staff words of iwi's concerns?
Yeah, no, I'm about to tell you what
it's
about, but yeah, no,
it's really
the bits in the boxes are verbatim what the feedback that we got from iwi.
Oh, so the recommendations are theirs.
As is. That if they're in the boxes, they're there.
We're just going to lead into the. Sorry, I'm just about. I've got an introduction now. We're going to hand over to who's going to run through the format of the papers and how we're going to approach it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd, and tēnā koutou councillors. Thanks for having us here once again. Just to remind you, this workshop was added at the request of councillors to allow you to consider and understand the feedback that we received. And as Lloyd mentioned, the feedback we received has been very high quality, really well considered, pragmatic and clear. And so I think Lloyd gave us the kudos for the structure of the document, but actually this was not our structure. So thanks to our partners for providing a nice clear structure for us to work through this in. Just before we get into it, I wanted to recap on what the process has been, and then, yeah, as I said, talk about how the briefing paper is structured and how we're going to run the session today. we're not sure we're going to need the full time. In fact, I think originally we only had 2 hours and then it got extended just because something else got cancelled. So if we finish early, that is absolutely fine. But of course, we're happy to continue for the time if needed. As with all the steps in the RMA process, Clause 4A sets out particular requirements. So the key points here that before we notify a proposed plan, we must provide a copy of the draft to the iwi authorities consulted under Clause 3. So the previous consultation step that we did earlier in the year to those same parties. So the iwi authorities were represented by Te Runanga o Ngātahu, Ōkaha and Te Ao Marama Inc. Secondly, we must have particular regard to any advice received on a draft proposed plan from those iwi authorities, which we're doing through this process today, but also through the Section 32 report. And finally, we must allow adequate time and opportunity for iwi authorities to consider the draft and to provide advice on it. So we sought advice from Ōkaha on how much time that would be considered adequate, and on that advice, allowed a period from the 15th of July to the 9th of August for feedback to be received. So staff also had 2 hui to discuss the feedback, one on the 2nd of August before the final came through, and another on the 20th of August, and as well as a few separate conversations about some specific matters. So yeah, the briefing paper that you received did start its life as the document that iwi authorities provided as their feedback. So it's got 2 parts to it. Part A sets out the key focus areas for feedback, and Part B contains the specific detailed amendments. So as I said before, the material in the boxes is the text. In the text of Part A is the verbatim feedback received from iwi authorities. And following each box, we added a section, staff response and recommendations, and that's what we'll mainly be focused on going through today. In Part B, which is the table, the unshaded comments are the iwi feedback, and the right-hand shaded column sets out the staff recommendation. Today we'll focus on Part A, and we were thinking only of dipping into Part B, kind of where there's specific questions, on any of those matters. As we've mentioned, it'll be a bit of a tag team effort as usual. So Felicity, Tom, Jackie, Danny and Tim are kind of sharing the presenting, but we've also got Sam and Amber and Delina online to help us answer questions on the specifics if needed. So for each of the 8 focus areas, we'll run through the key concerns and feedback received from iwi and explain the staff response and recommendation, and then have time for questions and discussions. Any thoughts or questions before we start? Shall we just kick into it? All right. Good. There was I forgot to mention that Felicity and Jackie may not be there, but they seem to have made it.
We have made it. Apologies, there are many roadworks in Christchurch at the moment that got in our way this morning, but we're here. Kia ora koutou. I'm just going to step through the first question in Part A, and the question posed by the iwi authorities was, is the strategic direction clear? And this relates to, I guess, the front end part of the plan that applies across the whole rest of the plan, the topic chapters and the FMU chapters as well. You might remember for the Clause 3 version, we have 3 chapters at the front: Mana Whenua chapter, integrated management and land and freshwater. And we got some good feedback from a number of parties through Clause 3 that they found that having the direction spread across 3 chapters was a bit confusing. And the iwi authorities in their Clause 4A feedback have acknowledged that the change we made to bring that all together into one chapter has been appreciated, and that they like it a lot more. They did raise some questions about the fish passage provisions and whether they were more appropriately located in the beds of lakes and rivers chapter, given that they relate largely to structures. And they had some questions about they had some concerns about the visibility of the FMU environmental outcomes, which is something that other parties raised in clause 3 as well, and it's been a topic that we've discussed around the council table previously as well. The final concern that they had on the strategic direction part was that they were a bit concerned about the use of qualifiers like where practicable, and they felt that some of the policies that those had been used in, particularly the mana whenua policies that they had originally prepared, was inappropriately weakened the direction in the policies. So in response to those concerns, and this begins on page 2 of your document, in terms of the fish passage provisions, we did explore the suggestions made by iwi authorities in terms of combining a couple of the objectives, but they are addressing 2 different things, so we prefer to keep them separate. In terms of the location, we have preferred to retain the fish passage provisions in the integrated management chapter so that they apply to, they certainly are relevant to beds of lakes and rivers, but they're also quite relevant to the damming chapter. And there'll also be some fish passage issues arising in some of the flood protection and drainage works managed by the flood chapter. So because the fish passage provisions do apply across a number of different activities, we think it's best to keep them in the integrated management chapter. In their written feedback, mana whenua didn't seek specific changes to the mana whenua policies, but they asked for a discussion with ORC to so that they could explain what their concerns were. That occurred last week, and they clarified that their concerns related to some of the wording in the policies, and some of those issues have now been resolved by removing some of the words that were either redundant or because they were probably not as well aligned with the higher order direction as they needed to be. In terms of the qualifiers, to the extent practicable, whether that qualifier is appropriate or not really depends on the provision itself and the context of it. And so you'll see there on page 3 at the bottom, we've stepped through each of the provisions that were raised by mana whenua and explained why the qualifier is either there, or we've realised that actually it probably shouldn't be there because it's inconsistent with the higher order direction. So some of them have stayed, some of them haven't.
Can we just get an idea of what this relates to? It's really hard reading this document and relaying it to clause 4, to version 4A. Can you just give us a wee bit of depth of what it means? Or do we have to go back and read each objective and policy?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And in some respects, it kind of relies on reading the table in part B. So objective 8 about is the first one in the bulleted list, was about the life supporting capacity and productive capacity of land and soils. And the qualifier where practicable was left there because it is consistent with the same direction in the RPS.
Yeah.
There's a policy in about rakatiratanga and kaitiakitaka, and we had originally, where relevant, taking into account iwi management plans, but mana whenua have pointed out that the direction in the the mana whenua chapter of the RPS doesn't have that qualifier, it just is a straight take into account. So we've agreed that it was appropriate to remove that qualifier. In terms of policy 5, where practicable was used, Sorry, I'm just flicking backwards and forwards between.
And it's just, you know, so I don't need every single one. I just wanted to understand that, and those two examples are great, but it's
Yeah.
really hard. Yeah.
Yeah,
Can I-
yeah, no, I
I
appreciate
don't even know
that.
that I've got the same version. That's the problem.
Yes, and you almost need to have part A open, part B open, and a copy of the plan to read them all together,
You're
which
right.
is,
Just for clarity, there's only one clause 4A version, so we all worked off the same
Okay,
version, the
great.
one that was circulated.
And that's the one that we've got.
That's the one that you got in July. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, what about what Richard sent us?
Same.
That's what, same thing,
It's the
isn't
same
it?
one. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I said that.
Again, yeah.
Thanks.
so a couple of other things. Mana Whenua sought to make the integrated management chapter a bit clearer, and broadly speaking, wherever a change was sought that would improve the clarity of a provision, we made that change. Mana Whenua wanted to ensure that the reference back to the long-term visions in the RPS was made clear. There's a little bit of difficulty in that with the visions currently being under appeal. And if you refer directly to those provisions as they are at the moment, does that lock you in to a version that doesn't incorporate whatever might come out of the appeal resolution? So we've done what we think is as much as we can do without shutting the door for appeal resolution. Mana Whenua had sought quite a lot more cross-referencing throughout the plan back to the integrated management chapter, and that's something we've discussed with the legal advisors and with the consents team and within the policy team a number of times. And the risk with cross-references is that if you start putting them in, you inevitably miss one somewhere, and we just don't want an error like that to affect the way the plan is read. Statutory interpretation is that you read the whole of the plan together and everything has to apply, and so the cross references back to the integrated management chapter aren't necessary because it always applies unless you get to a point through assessing an application where it turns out that some of the provisions are relevant. The last thing that Mana Whenua sought, and again this is something that has been quite common feedback, is that they just weren't quite clear on how the whole plan works together and how the integrated management chapter worked with the topic chapters and where the FMU chapters fitted. And they particularly asked for a diagram at the start of the integrated management chapter to give plan users just a really clear snapshot of how this plan works together. And we thought that was a really good idea. So you'll see on page 5 that we've proposed to include a new introduction to the integrated management chapter that just sets out how the plan works together and the relationship between the different chapters. So I think that's probably it on the first question. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Felicity. Do we have any questions?
Yes, sorry.
Yes, Michael, welcome.
Thank you. So just to clarify, because I don't have both papers open, has there been any change to the where practicable relating to the Manuhira care?
There aren't any provisions specifically for the Manuhira care in this part of the plan.
Cool, thank you.
Yes, Andrew.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Felicity. The where practicable, or extent reasonably practicable, are they common terms used in RMA planning?
Yes, they are.
And do they, by removing them, and I'm just talking generally rather than honing in on any particular provision that you've outlined there out of those 3 or 4 or whatever, does that narrow down the focus in terms of it moves away from it moves towards a one size fits all rather than taking into consideration on a case by case basis? Is that a fair comment?
I think the concern from iwi authorities is that their experience of the term where practicable is that it narrows down a decision maker's consideration to just cost. and doesn't take into account, what might be achievable and what improvements are needed for the health of a water body. So that's, I guess, the background to their concern. I don't think that removing where practicable necessarily narrows down what a decision maker considers, but it does have the effect of making the direction in the policy a bit more absolute. And so when we've been considering these, we've been quite careful to think about what is the higher order direction telling us about whether there should be a practicality consideration for a particular direction, or whether, perhaps in the NPS or in the RPS, there isn't that qualifier.
Right, I
Could
just
I-
want. Okay, someone else.
Andrew? Carol.
Oh, good, okay. So just coming back to your point, it tends to steer decision makers towards the financial aspect. But surely where practicable means more than that.
Yeah.
You know, whether something is capable or feasible or whatever, which includes financial consideration. But, if you narrow it down to something like wastewater, there would be so much more in the conversation around more than just the financial consideration, without going into detail. That, I'm just nervous about us moving towards a more, no disrespect to Mana Whenua, but a more of a tunnel vision on these provisions. That's all.
Yeah, no, I understand the concern, and I wouldn't say that what they are seeking is a removal of practicality considerations across the plan. It's more in these quite specific instances, and some of them are not about the practicality of managing a particular activity. It's about when you consider an iwi management plan, and so, and I guess there's some. It really depends on what the provision is trying to do and whether practicability is the right test or not. In a lot of instances it is, and in some instances it's not either, for largely because of the higher order direction.
Can I ask a supplementary to that?
It's on the same line, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it is. So let's take the wastewater treatment plants as a good example. At the moment, we've got where practicable, which in actual fact does relate to whether it can be afforded, the scale of the project, the effect upon the rating environment of that particular area. And let's just take Omakau and Alexandra as two examples in Central Otago. We're saying now in our plan, where practicable, you should discharge to land. But in those particular cases, the practicality might be better to discharge to water because the costs are just so excessive. Are we now retaining that as the staff advice to retain where practicable in those instances?
Yes, it is, for exactly the reasons that you've outlined.
Thank you.
Kilo.
So where you are actually taking that clause out, would it not be an alternate way to actually describe or ensure that that clause is applied correctly as opposed to just a price? Because where you're taking it out, you're saying that that the decision makers tend to go just to cost. So surely that is, that's narrowing down a focus onto costs, whereas if you leave that in, practicable means more than just cost. So I'm just saying, why would you take that out? Why would you not? I suppose that's my question: is why don't we define the extent practicable, what that encompasses?
Yeah, there is a definition in the RMA of a term, best practicable option, and it's more than just cost. It goes to the range of elements that make up what might be practicable in terms of what's technically able to be done, that kind of thing. I guess from the mana whenua perspective is that when they've seen the word practicable applied in consenting decisions, it's usually it's usually just coming down to cost in turn, and that becomes the threshold. I guess just to go back to these provisions that we're talking about at the moment, we're not necessarily talking about consent, you know, the applicant's measures being proposed by an applicant. That's often not what we're talking about in these provisions. And just as an example, we had in a policy on cross-boundary matters where practicable, having regard to effects on receiving environments that might be in a different region. And what the feedback from iwi authorities is, well, ORC has to have regard to the effects of a proposal. It's not limited to only the receiving environment that's within its jurisdiction. Those effects might flow on, you know, to another area, and it's the RMA sets up a regime where the decision maker does consider those effects. Doesn't necessarily manage them because they're in another jurisdiction, but it does consider them in its decision making. And so their request was to remove where practicable, because that suggests a watering down of what the RMA requires. So I guess it's just really important to make sure that we're talking, that we're conscious of the context of where each reference is coming to where practicable.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, but I just think it all of a sudden limits. Yeah, if their focus is on cost and the way things have historically been done, should we just not be correcting the way things have historically been done? Because by taking it out, you're all of a sudden saying the cost is irrelevant, so you're going to have to do it.
I wouldn't say that cost would be an irrelevant consideration. I guess it's just looking at each of these provisions and determining whether where practicable is the right qualifier to have, or whether there is a reason for needing to just implement a clause the way it's written without a qualification. But I take your point that fundamentally the issue that iwi authorities are raising is one with the implementation of the RMA, and if there's a way to address that, perhaps that's what we should be looking at.
Thanks, Felicity.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, we'll move on to Tom.
My question's around the part of the plan where this where these terms are used. So we're looking at part 2, management of resources, integrated management, and also the integrated policies. Is this chapter like a higher order chapter that sort of cascades down into other parts of the document, the plan? Because if that's the case, if we're taking where practical out of this higher level chapter, surely it has an influence through the rest of the plan. Is that correct?
Yes. So this chapter does sit at the front of the plan, and it applies on top of all of the provisions in the rest of the plan. But where practicable is used in lots and lots of different contexts throughout the plan, and so removing it from one clause of one policy in the integrated management chapter doesn't necessarily change the policy approach being taken in another chapter. There's certainly, from my perspective, removing the where practicable, where I've recommended removing it in the integrated management chapter, doesn't affect the way that, for example, wastewater is being managed and whether there's a practicality test being applied there. It's quite limited to specific decision-making considerations.
Okay, so it could be quite correct to have the highest requirement in this chapter, and it actually then becomes perhaps watered down or something in other chapters. Is that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say watered down. I guess this chapter is
wrong word. I just couldn't think of the thing.
Yeah. No, I understand what you mean. I mean, this chapter is generally trying to be quite broad. It's trying, unless it needs to, it's generally trying to keep things quite broad so that the topic chapters can have the flexibility to take the approach that they need to take to managing a particular activity. But there are some reasons that this chapter there isn't a lot of room to move on some of the wording because of what your NPS or your RPS says.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, we've got a clean board, so I think we can move on. That's good discussions, and I'd pretty much all those things marked as well on my piece of paper, so, but we can move now to topic 2.
Oh,
A lake, oh, we also have a lake cover.
yeah, well, no, I've got a whole heap of questions in that section.
Yeah,
That's possible. So if we're going back to page 2, where I'm just trying to get an understanding on the LFFWP 14.
Yep.
Where that refers to that. So is that, and it may not have changed because I haven't, is that the panel's version of the LFFWP 14, or is it on the original notified RPS version?
That's the panel's version.
Panel's version, oh yeah, it was gold. And so a further question on that same page. Going down into 5 on page 2, and that's talking about environmental outcomes to seek to provide protection and restoration of habitat for threatened species. So is that the so just bear with me while I read this. Is that protection? Is that the protection of the existing area that of existing areas that are degraded, to restore them back to a suitable level, or is it to take back what may be developed land to provide additional habitat? And where would I see the wording to confirm if it was one or the other?
I think this refers to, I think Councillor Malcolm's question is about the environmental outcome for threatened species, which you might be better to speak to. I certainly wouldn't have interpreted it as requiring taking land. It's more about restoring habitats that are degraded, in rivers and water bodies, restoring those habitats for threatened species.
Yes, I might be able to help. As worded in the Clause 4A version, that objective currently seeks to protect the existing habitat of indigenous species. And what iwi have asked for is to amend that objective to include for restoration. And we've basically, the advice that we're giving as staff is to keep it as it is and not to include restoration in there. For 2 reasons. As it is worded now, protecting the existing habitat is aligned with the policy in the NPSFM. And secondly, it would broaden the application of the objective, which at this point is not considered a good way of dealing with it. But we do recognize that restoration is something that we're seeking to do through the environmental outcomes when it deals with threatened species. So one subset of the indigenous freshwater species is already provided for through the environmental outcomes. So we're proposing not to change it at the moment and keep that objective as just providing for the protection of existing habitat.
Of existing habitat.
Yes.
Yeah. So where would I confirm that definition?
It's in that objective IO07.
Yeah.
Yes, I just read IOs.
Yeah.
Cool. Perfect, thanks for that, thank you.
Kevin, we could just go to Kate for a minute and come back to you if you go.
Just to follow up, and it's an interesting one. I can understand if you, I think I've got, if you extended it, it would actually be more imposing.
Yes.
But as long as it's still empowering,
Yeah.
and there's this a distinction.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is nothing there, so there may be empowering policies that allow you to do that stuff to increase the habitat or restore the habitat, but there is nothing that requires you to.
That's
That, as long as we've got the empowering balance, right?
Thanks, Kate. Kevin, do you have more questions?
Yeah. So on, and I might have just misread this, on number 7 on page 3. So iwi, as I read that phrase, iwi are still yet to make a final decision on their position, yet staff recommend an amendment to address this in part B.
So it says they have had the discussions and they've clarified the concerns. Just at the very top of number 7. Mana Whenua asked for further discussion, the Cesar
Yeah.
Committee wants clarified that their concerns were.
Yeah, right, I'll reread that. Good. I'll probably read that. Yeah, correct. Sorry, I read that wrong. Thank you.
Still going with that?
Oh, I'm not, no, I'll probably,
We can always come back.
yeah. It's just quite hard to follow when you go into next. Sorry. No, that's cool.
Awesome, thanks very much. Good to make sure we get everybody understanding where we're at. So we can, thanks for listening. We can, I think now we can move on to the number 2,
Thank you.
which will be formula.
So topic number 2 of part A really relates to the environmental outcomes. And iwi have raised 2 concerns with respect to the environmental outcomes. Not necessarily how they're drafted, but how they are presented in the plan. And the first concern is really about they want to make sure that there's a clear link between the environmental outcomes, which are currently stated in the FMU chapters, and the strategic direction, because in their view, they're part of the strategic direction. The second concern is concern around making sure that those environmental outcomes are also embedded within the provisions of topic chapters. They've come up with 2 recommendations. Their recommendation with respect to making sure that the environmental outcomes are linked to the strategic directions is to make reference to them. And they've suggested to include, for example, a table with the environmental outcomes, which is something that we support. So staff are recommending to have the environmental outcomes also stated at the front part of the plan in the IM chapter. So we're not changing the wording, and we're also not proposing to remove them from the FMU chapters. They'll still stay in the FMU chapters, but they will also be stated at the front, like I said. Secondly, they're also concerned about, as I said, making sure that the environmental outcomes are included in the topic chapters and provisions of the topic chapters. Felicity previously mentioned that she made some amendments, or she proposed some amendments to part 1, and also to the provisions in the IM chapter to make clear that when people are undertaking activities in the plan, under the plan, or when decision makers are considering consent applications, that they actually need to look at the entire plan, the strategic outcomes, or the strategic direction, sorry, the topic chapters, but also the environmental outcomes in the FMU chapters. So that's one way of making sure that they're considered throughout the plan. The second suggestion that iwi made was to work with them in kind of mapping out to see how actually we're providing for those environmental outcomes through the different provisions. We didn't have time to actually do that, but we had to go at it ourselves because it's a very sensible thing to ask, really. Now we've got to make distinction between provisions that provide for consented activities and permitted activity rules. With the first one, where you've got a provision that relates to a consented activity, that drives you towards considering policies and objectives. And there, it's actually quite easy to refer to your environmental outcomes or to your target attribute states that are seeking to achieve them. So we did that, and we're also proposing some amendments just to make sure that the objectives actually make proper reference to the long-term visions, the environmental outcomes, and also the attribute states, target attribute states, because they're all linked together. With respect to the permitted activities, it's a little bit more difficult. When you write a permitted activity condition, those conditions need to be clear and certain. And simply referring to an environmental outcome doesn't work in that way. It's really hard to kind of have a condition to a permitted activity condition that says you need to achieve this because the environmental outcomes are quite high level. So instead, what we've done is to look at those environmental outcomes and the values they provide for, and try to translate those environmental outcomes into standard conditions that will achieve those. So at the end of the document, we've included an appendix, and that gives you a bit of an overview of the different standard permitted activity conditions that we've used throughout the plan, the values and the outcomes that they relate to, and also the chapters where we use them. When reading or when looking at that table though, do bear in mind that, for example, when we say that a certain permitted activity condition is used in a specific chapter, it does not necessarily mean that we consistently use it in every single provision, because that would not be appropriate. For example, let's think about the first chapter, activities on the beds of lakes and rivers. We might have a permitted activity condition that says you shouldn't put a dam in a or structure in a location where there's threatened species habitat, and that would be sensible. But when it comes to a rule that provides for the use of that structure, having that same condition in there, or for the maintenance of that structure, having that same condition in there would actually prevent you from using that structure. So it might not be appropriate. So that's, I just wanted to explain why we wouldn't apply conditions consistently throughout every single rule.
Thank you, Tom. Do we have questions?
Take questions.
We've got Kate.
Sorry, I think you're missing a type of permitted activity in that analysis, which is one that provides a benefit. And it's a really negative way of putting it. There are a lot of empowered permitted activities that could be referenced there that is going to have a good outcome. And sometimes if you're only looking at activities in a negative sense, it's not balanced. I'm really delighted to see that. I mean, I talked about it before, something that's logical, you can see it upwards and backwards, that it's linked to things, and that's a much stronger plan. So I'm really delighted to see that emphasis. But I think, yeah, we need to talk about things being positive, and there are a lot of positive activities out there that are permitted.
Thank you, Kate. Tom, you must have
Pine trees will be in there after that report.
done a pretty good job. There are questions? Everybody's pretty happy? Awesome. So we'll carry on to the next chapter.
That's Felicity, I think.
Yep, that's me.
What page?
Page 8.
Okay.
Yes, so this is question 3 in part A, which is starts on page 8. And the question posed was, is the approach to considering mana whenua values clear and consistent? There are two things that I'll talk about here. The main piece of feedback from mana whenua relates to what they've referred to in here as APP9, which is an appendix that has a series of tables setting out descriptions of what mana whenua would like to see in as a result of managing water quality, water quantity, flows, natural character, things like that. So in the clause 3 version of the plan, that appendix was referred to as mana whenua freshwater outcomes, and there was a lot of feedback from parties about whether they were environmental outcomes and how these outcomes fitted with the environmental outcomes and with the outcomes sought generally by the plan, because they were a lot more stringent than the environmental outcomes, or a lot more aspirational, I guess. The discussion that we had with mana whenua post the clause 3 consultation was that we didn't think that they were outcomes, and that was the wrong word to use. And mana whenua agreed with that. They confirmed that they were not seeking that these would be environmental outcomes like we've got in the FMU chapters. That's not what they were intended to do. The way that Mana Whenua described it was that these are essentially a yardstick for measuring that applicants and decision makers can use to understand how far the way that they're managing their activity, how well that aligns with what Mana Whenua would like to see in terms of the management of activities, and that decision, the extent to which an activity was being undertaken in a way that was consistent with Mana Whenua values would then form part of the decision making, but it wouldn't be a black and white yes or no kind of decision making consideration. So in the clause 4A version of the plan, we referred to these as Mana Whenua aspirations for land and water to clarify that they were not outcomes being sought and to differentiate them from the environmental outcomes. The concern that's been raised now in the clause 4A feedback was that Mana Whenua aren't sure that aspirations is the right terminology to use. We've had an initial conversation with them about whether they intended these, the content of the appendix to be, if it's a yardstick, are these criteria? And are they about an outcome, or are they about a management approach? Are they criteria for achieving a particular outcome? And so we've had an initial discussion with Mana Whenua, and we haven't landed on exactly the term that will be in the title of the appendix. But what I can confirm is that there is agreement between Mana Whenua and ORC staff that these are not outcomes that the plan is trying to achieve. And whatever way we refer to them, we need to be very clear that they are not environmental outcomes. They're not objectives that are trying to be achieved by the plan. They are a way of understanding how far a proposal goes towards being done in a way that's consistent with Mana Whenua values. So that conversation is still ongoing about the actual specific wording that goes into the plan, but I'm confident that there is an agreement on both sides about what this thing is trying to do, and that it's not, overriding the environmental outcomes that were set with the community. That is the main.
Sorry, Kate's just got a quick question, I think, on that.
So
Yes.
I'm just interested in whether I've got this right. They're almost Mana Whenua reference points or reference guidelines. And so, but it's how they're then given effect to or are used in the plan. Now, there's a whole lot of times where APP 9 is referred to, and if I were developing a farm plan at a catchment action plan, for example, I may reference those and say these are, that we're wanting to work with Mana Whenua to get to these reference points. Our way of doing that in this catchment may be that there may be some that don't get increased or referenced or improved, but other areas may. Is that how you see that being used?
Yes, that's exactly how they're supposed to be used. They're supposed to be a way to understand what Mana Whenua values are and how to manage activities in a way that's consistent with Mana Whenua values.
But it won't necessarily impose that you have to meet those values.
No, it absolutely won't. And that's the part that needs.
And that's what I take from it. It's a really healthy way when we can't get engagement in a catchment to reference at least where those catchment points may be. Thank you.
Yes, and part of the reason that Mana Whenua have done this work is because they don't want to be involved in every consent application, having to reiterate what their values are and what their perspectives are. This is a way that they see they can outline what their values are and how they would like to see activities managed, and then people can take that into consideration on themselves in their consent applications, and the consent officers can consider that when they're processing without having to, have Mana Whenua involved as a party in these consent applications.
Well, and that sounds great, and I'm really happy. I mean, we all want to have an easier pathway or less delay. The question is, what will trigger actually having to consult with iwi other than APP 9? Because I presume at maybe discretionary you don't, or is it non-compliant you do? I'm interested in seeing how that then applies, and whether farm plans or the alternative pathway can always work through that. So it sounds good. I'm still nervous about when that other a step would be triggered, I expect that there will be some triggers, and I'm not quite sure that I understand that.
Yes, and I think that would have to be context specific. I think you would have to look at a particular application and to understand whether it's something that you would identify mana whenua as being an affected party or not.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. As understanding they will be affected, and certainly there are some rivers that, say the Waitaki, that they will be wanting to have a higher interest in. And there's a number of those. I get that. The question is, if I'm meeting those APP 9, and I think I can do at least improve or at least be neutral with, at times, you need to have some certainty in the process. And surely it would be triggered by the discretionary RD non-compliant or something trigger that would say, if it's a declaration APP 9, or if it's non-compliant, you need to do that next step more. I think we need to be really clear how it's going to be done, don't we?
Felicity, I was just asking the question of whether the plan, so some older plans have notification provisions, attached to the rules and things, but this plan doesn't have that. Specifically, does it?
It's just one, maybe, yeah, it's like a very specific one. I can't think what it is.
It's flood chapter, flood protection and drainage works has a specific requirement to consult with mana whenua, because those works are generally being undertaken across a number of catchments, and they can be quite, they determine how the rivers move and that kind of thing. But generally there isn't a blanket mana whenua are identified as an affected party in every circumstance.
And the presumptions in the Act in terms of affected party approvals have changed, haven't they? I'll just say maybe it's a Joe question. Joe's nodding.
Sorry, yes, they have. So it doesn't assume that you are affected. You have to say why they would be. So it's more assuming someone isn't and improving why they are.
So on that basis, all things being equal, without an application in front of us, if somebody had an application that complied with APP 9, based on the presumptions of the Act, you wouldn't necessarily need written approval from me. But we can't say that for certain because we don't have an application in front of us. But that's the way that the Act is. So the Act flipped a few years ago.
No, I appreciate that, and I'm sure that they're enjoying not having to suffer some of the work they had to do. The question though is, I got the feeling reading the plan, but I didn't have this focus on it with all respect, is that there were some, like if it's a Waihi Tapuna site, you would have to. No?
So can we just let this one percolate for
What
a
is
while?
it?
We've got
Okay.
a board full of questions and we can come
Yeah.
back to it if we don't get some more clarity. That's all right, because we sort of like, unless you got anything there now?
And the assumption, I would say yes, Kate. I would say my assumption, if I was an applicant and it was a Waihi Tapuna site or a Nohoaka site,
Yeah.
you'd be more likely to need iwi's written approval than if it wasn't. But it's not I can't give you a certain answer because we haven't got the application, but they would be the sorts of things, a statutory acknowledgement area and the Settlement Act, those types of areas.
I just,
a
I think
highly
it's
sensitive
really helpful to
activity.
test some of this stuff and how practical it is, and yeah.
No, that's awesome. Thanks. I've got Michael, Andrew, Kevin.
Thank you. This seems a bit messy. A decision maker, according to what you've just said, must have cognizance of mana whenua values, except they're not values, outcomes, or aspirations, because you've just had that discussion and we don't know. And those three concepts are out. So I don't know what we're really into imprecision now. And it seems to invite a subjective evaluation by the consent officer and almost invite later court definition as to what, in actual fact, mana whenua values are. I think we need to reduce that uncertainty. And so I would encourage you and staff to work a bit harder on this, because at the moment it seems messy to me. And the lack of clarity and definition is going to, I would surmise, present difficulties later on. We need more definition, not less, don't we? Particularly in relationship to vague terms like what a value is. Don't we need to be much more precise?
Yes, we do, and that is what we're working with mana whenua to resolve, because I agree with you that it is we can't have that kind of uncertainty in the plan. We need to have a very clear understanding of what these are and when they apply and how they're supposed to be interpreted by decision makers. So that's certainly what we're trying to do. The staff that we've been working with at the iwi authorities are on leave this week, so we just haven't been able to resolve it in time for this meeting, but it's certainly not something that we've dropped off the list.
Okay, thank you. So when will we expect to see some sort of return to that? When's the idea that this comes back to us as a meeting? Is it later on this month?
I understand the plan. There is a workshop on the full plan on the 16th of September, which is in a couple of weeks. So certainly there'll be certainty provided to councillors then.
Hopefully, you just want to clarify time frame.
Yeah, sure. So it'll be in the version that goes to council on the 17th, but the discussion on it can occur on the 2nd of October.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm always working to the deadline for finishing the document, not the. Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So there's
plan,
on the 24th of September, which is going to focus on the Section 32 report, and then a following workshop on the, I think it's the 2nd, but it might be the 3rd. No, the 2nd of October, where we'll go through all the plan drafting. So you'll get to see all of this drafting then, and so we will make sure that this is a topic that we cover during that session.
All good here.
So just to that point, Lloyd, is what I was on. So because in paragraph 22, your last statement on this the APP 9 is use an alternative criteria in this way, or if so, may seek it through a submission to the land and water plan. So is that your holding statement to say what you've just said to us, that you're still negotiating that and hopefully get a resolve to it?
Yeah, my understanding is that we are going to continue working with Mana Whenua to address this. If for whatever reason it's not able to be resolved by the time the plan is notified, then we will stick with what's in there at the moment, and Mana Whenua might lodge a submission.
Right. So in if their position of freshwater values is inconsistent with or conflicts with the community or the FMU values that have been established, how does that then affect a consenting process? What trumps what?
Māori freshwater values are the values refer to values that were identified in each of the FMUs, and so it necessarily includes mahinga kai because that's a compulsory value, but it also refers to, in Otago talks, refers to wahi tupuna and taoka species. My understanding is that the environmental outcomes for all of those values, the Māori freshwater values, but all of the other ones as well, have been prepared together, and the idea is that they work together, they're not in conflict.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's the theory, but what happens if they are in conflict, if we haven't got that resolved?
In terms of the content of the appendix, I think we need to be clear, and I have total faith that we will reach a point at which Mana Whenua and ORC are on the same page. I don't see this as a significant issue. It's just timing, really. But the plan will need to be very clear that that what's in the appendix does not override the environmental outcomes, and it is not imposing objectives that must be achieved. That, as a bottom line, that will be clarified in the plan.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. That's good. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Sorry, Andrew, we sort of went around and we're back to you now.
No worries. Just going back to the word aspiration. In an RMA sense, surely an aspiration would have to be something that is obtainable or achievable, or it's not just a wish, so to speak.
Yes, and I didn't love that wording, if I have to say. I guess it was, the difficult thing with this appendix is that it's describing what Māori would like to see, but it's not necessarily describing what this plan is going to achieve. That's the sort of distinction that we're navigating at the moment. And when you get into using words like objective or outcome, that has kind of planning connotations for, you know, a type of provision, which is not the type of provision that this appendix is. So I'm not sure that aspirations was really the best word to use. It was just used to clarify that they're not objectives being sought to be achieved by the plan, but it's not a great word.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. We have Kate.
I feel like I'm moving backwards and probably I'll be told this is up for discussion, but I do wonder why some of the wastewater provisions to land weren't in this chapter, right, in APP 9 as a reference or aspiration, given the problems of that and the body of the plan directed to improvement state. It just, yeah. The wastewater discharge to land seems so onerous in our soils in Otago in most parts that it would be a really neat thing to have, but it's having it built into the plan is going to cause us so many problems. And this APP 9 seems to have been a better place to properly put that. But we haven't had the I don't think we've had the latest copy of, maybe it's just one of the other attachments I haven't had a good look at.
Well, we're constrained in terms of the structure by the planning standards, so wastewater is required to be.
I know, I appreciate it, but
Yeah.
but building it into Manawhina will want that, and I totally get that they want it, but the hurdle that builds in our plan is so substantial. It would have been a really good reference point in APP 9, as opposed to putting it such a into the, it would have been a much better place for it in my mind, having had that discussion about what APP 9 is for. Anyway, just.
Thanks, Kate, for noting that.
Yeah, and I would just on that point, Kate, there is a reference to the Mana Whenua preference for no direct discharges of any contaminants in that appendix. So it is listed there as something that is important to them, but like we've said, that's not imposing an obligation on the rest of the plan to always manage activities in that way.
Still a fairly high bar though.
All good. Do we have any other questions or a clear board at this stage?
Yep.
Kevin?
Yeah, just, it's probably just a wording on the first 4 words of clause 23 on page 9. And it says council has acknowledged that in parts of the Otago region, target states and environmental outcomes are unlikely to be achieved. Now, I can't ever remember having a vote or a decision being made that was our decision. So if that's a science staff position, so be it, but I can never call voting on that or be given being asked to make a decision on that.
So we had that discussion. You might recall ORC chose to submit on the RPS because for exactly that reason. So what we said is this plan wasn't going to be enough to get us to the target attribute states. That was the starting point, and we wanted to make sure that the panel for the RPS had that information as they were considering the RPS in terms of timeframes. We didn't recommend timeframes. We just said this plan is a first step, and it won't take us all the way. It was in quite a few of the science papers over time, but I suppose the main way that we did that was through that submission to the RPS. But that was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and so that was a workshop direction.
So legal position right up.
Yeah, I'll find out how.
That's all right. I don't,
submission
I'll
goes.
just
No,
make
no,
it.
it won't take long. If I can track it down, I'll.
No, don't. You've got things to do.
Thanks, Kevin. You all good there now?
Yeah.
Cool. We'll go on to Item 4 is climate change for insufficient attention. Who's funding this
So
one?
that's Felicity again. You?
Oh, welcome back, Philip. We've been missing you.
Kia ora. Yes, so this, the question posed was, is climate change given sufficient attention? And this really just comes to, what I take away from the iwi feedback here is that they hadn't had time to carry out a thorough review of how climate change had been addressed in the Land and Water Plan, and they were seeking some comfort that the plan does deal with climate change. And they asked for, what they would like to see is, I guess, a mapping of how consideration of climate change has been embedded throughout the plan. So that's what we've done in the following couple of pages. In our view, climate change is addressed across the Land and Water Plan. It's just, if you did a word search for climate change, it doesn't necessarily come up in those exact words, because there's just different ways that we're dealing with climate change, and some of them use the term climate change. Sometimes it's more about, we're dealing with extreme weather events, and we need to make sure that our erosion and sediment control plans are appropriately targeted to deal with those weather events. So from paragraph 27 on, essentially, the climate change response has its beginning in the integrated management chapter. There's an objective about climate change, which acknowledges the role of renewable electricity generation and meeting the national emissions reduction targets. There's then a policy about natural hazard risk that provides direction on managing activities in those areas subject to natural hazards, which might be exacerbated by the effects of climate change. There's a policy IP P16, which requires decision makers on all applications to have particular regard to the effects of climate change, to the extent that that's going to be relevant in a particular application. Policy 18, consent duration, provides a pathway for those longer duration consents for activities that are contributing to environmental outcomes, and in doing so are likely to be responding to the effects of climate change as well, particularly if you're replacing an existing activity with one that's got lower contaminant losses, or is reducing the use of the water, just generally being more efficient. So the consent duration policy is really trying to incentivise those activities with positive impacts, which will assist with this plan to address the effects of climate change. In addition to that integrated management chapter, which talks about climate change pretty specifically, there's then different approaches taken in the topic chapters. So, for example, in the beds of lakes and rivers, there's a policy that requires consent applicants to consider how their activity might be affected by climate change, and include measures being taken to avoid or mitigate those effects. Contaminated land chapter provides some specific direction on identifying and remediating contaminated land that's at risk of the effects of climate change through natural hazards. That's your erosion and flooding risks generally. And that applies to closed landfills as well. There are some that are now under threat because of the effects of climate change. Damming, for works in the beds, the beds of lakes and rivers policy applies, that requires considering the effects of climate change. There's also reference to management of natural hazards throughout those provisions. And I guess one of the key points of one of the key policy approaches in the damming chapter is to enable off-stream storage, so that people can be more resilient to, if there are changes in rainfall or river flows, building resilience within the communities by having water storage that helps take the edge off some of those climate change effects. Earthworks, sediment and erosion control plans are required, and for consented earthworks, and like I said before, those plans have to take into account the likelihood of seasonal variability of weather and extreme weather events, and some of those will occur more often with the effects of climate change. Environmental flows, levels and allocation. Climate change comes through in two ways. First is by again, linked to the water storage aspect, you know, it's setting up a regime where people can be more resilient to the effects of climate change because they're storing water and are not so affected by the run of the river. There are also the other way that the EFL chapter addresses climate change is that the flows intake limits are use the metric of 7-day MELF, mean annual low flow, and that calculation of what is the 7-day MELF changes over time because it's based on previous data. So as the effects of climate change start to be experienced and rivers change, river flows change, then the 7-day MELF also adjusts to reflect what's actually happening in the river. Flood protection and drainage assets. There's a really clear direction in this chapter about you encouraging nature-based solutions, which we know are often a good way to respond to the effects of climate change and improve resilience to those effects. Primary production relies mostly on the integrated management provisions. Waste and landfills, again, going back to the locating landfills and that kind of thing, making sure that we're locating them in areas that aren't going to be subject to natural hazard events, particularly where they might be exacerbated by climate change. And in wastewater, again, linking back to the integrated management chapter, that you have to have regard to the effects of climate change, which might affect how much wastewater is being produced and what method of treatment is going to be appropriate in the circumstances.
Thank you, Felicity. Kate has a question.
I've got two questions. I just want to test them. You've heard me, I'm sure, board people about what storage looks like and where you put it. The conveyance provisions suggest that we should be piping everything and not use the river. I don't understand how that works for climate change. When storage up high with cool water, adding to river flows is actually a really both pragmatic and deals with climate change. I'm really concerned that the rules in that respect actually potentially push you to a different outcome. Can I understand what I've obviously got wrong then?
I think on damming, the policy approach that was provided, or the approach preferred by the council was to encourage loss.
We haven't made a decision on that yet, sorry. I'd hate us to have made a decision when we haven't had the pros and cons. Just making it very clear, because that's the process, we have to have the pros and cons for the costs and benefits before we make those decisions.
Okay.
That's what the law says, sorry. Good. So we haven't made a decision, thank you.
That's right, so we just.
Yeah, but sorry.
Do you want to talk about conveyance?
The actual question for conveyance.
Yeah, the conveyance. So the conveyance is at the moment it's telling us to pipe it, preference to pipe, when the climate change response would be if you can keep it in the river and convey it, you will be assisting river flows, and I can't see the benefit provision being provided for. I only see the conveyance, pipe it at a cost. There are benefits with conveyance in streams, and we haven't acknowledged that, and I couldn't see a pathway, but I could have it wrong. It's a big plan and I'm not that bright, obviously.
I think the best one for that is just for somebody up an Eagle or for someone, we just go back and see what's confirm what we're at with that. And at the end of the day, Kate's got an opinion. And I think
Well, no, I'm sorry, the conveyance rule is in there.
Why can't we hear an answer now?
Yeah. Okay.
I can speak to conveyance now.
We don't irrigate in Tapanui or something.
Yeah.
Okay, just an answer.
That's good.
Okay.
I can comment on the conveyance policy that's in the EFL chapter, if that's what you're referring to.
I presume it is, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a policy in EFL P12 about conveyance, and it does seek to minimise losses from systems. So for new systems, it does set a figure and requires that losses are no greater than 10% of the rate of take. And then for existing systems, there's encouragement to phase out or to improve conveyance systems to try and minimise losses down to that 10% figure. There is some room to move there, acknowledging that that's not always going to be practical or reasonable for existing systems. And so I hear what you're saying, but I guess it's a balancing point in many catchments which are at or over allocation limits, that we're also trying to minimise inefficient use of water. And if a lot of water's been taken and then leaked out of the system, that's quite an inefficient use of that water.
That's my second question, that one, and I will happily deal with that now or then. The first question is the one that says don't use the river for the flow. Conveyance should be out of river. And my point of climate change is that if we get low flows, using the river as a conveyance is actually a really good climate change response. And I want to understand why that benefit isn't acknowledged or considered as a climate change response. But, I mean, this year, I think MIC were asked to discharge more to help the river. It's a really good response tool. And I can't see how that pathway is provided for when you've got something that's telling you to take it out of the river.
So I think we get into the issue of cross mixing there, and where rivers are used.
No, it isn't cross mixing.
Is there a policy?
I'm not sure what policy you're referring
Yeah,
to. There's a policy on
that's the
cross
question.
mixing.
Is there a policy that says that it's better to take water out of the river and put it into a pipe or race than there is to do run of the river, is really the first thing. So is Kate right that there's something that says that? And you're saying no, but.
There is the conveyance policy does say for new systems, the use of a river to artificially convey water is avoided.
And that's the one that I'm concerned about.
Can I have attempt at answering that?
Yeah,
I think that the reasons behind that policy stance, there's a number of reasons behind it. First of all, I think there's a desire to kind of have rivers flow as much as possible as they would behave naturally. And I think there's a risk that you kind of alter the flow regime by using them as conveyance tools, especially when you're releasing a lot of water at times when the river should actually flow low naturally. The other thing, there's also concerns about pest species and possibly having undesirable species providing better habitat for them through those higher flows as well.
Is that trout?
Well, I mean, depends where they are. So I think those are kind of key reasons why there's a preference not to have that. Also, it poses challenges in terms of our freshwater accounting as well, like keeping track of like which bit is actually augmented water and which bit within the river is actually natural flow water.
I absolutely get that those are concerns, but there is also a benefit, as we found in the last year, of schemes that may add to a river flow. And if we don't have that balance, sorry, this is a response to climate change. I was going to bring it up later, but this is exactly a response to climate change that makes sense. We're going to have less snow melt. If we get less snow, we're going to have less snow melt. We're going to have a variation in the river that's very different from what I'm going to consider as melt now. Great that you've acknowledged that. But I just can't understand why you haven't got a balance in there, as we've seen, to a response to climate change. And I'm really happy to pick up that efficiency one anytime you like.
Thanks, Kate. I think, Kevin, you might have a question along the same lines. We got Elliot as well.
Yeah, I am. Well, I'm really struggling with the forcing of water to be, forcing it to be put into a pipe situation, and that all of a sudden we have where we've used a very inexpensive way of conveying water called gravity, and then you're putting it into a pipe and having to pump and pump and use energies to do that. And so it actually just doesn't add up. And if you look at some systems that have been in place for close to 100 years, and we're forcing that in the next consenting regime to go into pipes, it actually just doesn't add up, because we've already created within that close to 100 years, we've created habitats and environments that all of a sudden we're going to destroy. So I'm just.
I thought this was just for
It's quite hard to understand.
I realise it's technically only for new, but if you're forcing that, you're missing out on what is being created by systems that already exist. And we know, like the Canterbury Way has forced everyone to go into pipes, and the environmental effect from that has just been huge. The environmental degradation caused by that has been huge, and the changing of the environment. So I'm just struggling to find the environmental gains of putting everything into a pipe. And what is, and what we look at efficiency and percent, a percentage of water taking, being used from a system, but surely there's more to efficiency is around environmental gains and environmental benefits. So I think I'd really like to have that efficiency debate somewhere. So.
Thanks, Kevin. I've got Elliot.
Yeah, just
Do we need to-
is it on? I was just thinking if it's not just climate change generally, so I'm happy
so
to
we might
leave
just-
it. I think we need to close,
we need
to
close this discussion off because there's some open questions obviously around this, and so I don't know if Fleur looked like you're about to say something.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just asking Tom, just to confirm, like, the conveyancing policy that we have was, did come from the council direction that we had. So if you wanted to revisit that, it can definitely be done. It's just, so, but it might not be that this is the time for having that discussion. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I know you want to talk,
No,
Kate. Just.
We'll just go to Brian.
Yeah, I'd just like some clarification on the evaporation, because it's one of the significant reasons as well, isn't it?
Well,
The amount of evaporation.
I think that's the challenge that I referred to earlier with freshwater accounting. Like you lose water, whether it could be through infiltration through the ground. If you augment rivers, you're going to lose more water, possibly, or you could some of it could be evaporated as well.
What type of percentages? That's my question.
It will depend, probably case by case. You'll also have possibly permitted activity takes as well, so it becomes really hard to kind of keep track of what is that augmented water. I totally get the point about there are some benefits in it, but it's also it's a tricky one because at times it kind of keeps the river cool, but when you have actually low storage, you release possibly hot water as well. So it's a very tricky dilemma.
Thanks, Todd. We got Gretchen.
Sorry, I was just, that's all good. We're gonna have a number of topics. This is one of them that we haven't quite resolved by the time we get to the end of this process, I think is what I'm feeling. There'll be a list of hot topics, I suppose. And yeah, there's going to be a debate around whether we've given direction or not. I think that might be what Kate's feeling at the moment. And then also if our direction changes at this point. So it's not, I don't think it's just specific to this particular example. And so we're going to have to work through clearly what happens if that comes up. Yeah, and that's a question for ourselves, I think. But we're going to get stuck on it if we try to solve them all now.
I wonder if the option is because you're right, Gretchen, there'll be more than just this one.
Yeah.
And I think maybe where we have these sort of hot topics, we just need to go away, go back. We're very clear, and I made it very clear again to Kate that there have been no decisions made, and Fleur actually said direction again. So let's just square that away. We need to just go back and test that direction through those various, and is that actually where that direction arrived that is now consistent with what we put in the draft, or could it have been applied a different way? And how have we reached what we've reached? So we just need to go back and test those different steps that we've made through the process. And then when we do come back to have a discussion on the plan, there'll be a few of those hot topics that I think we can just talk through the steps and whether or not staff on review feel that could have, that direction could have gone a different, and then we're just going to have to assess whether that changes sort of within the scope of what we can change at that point. But I think we will get stuck today if we try to go right back, but we do need to go back and test it on some of these bigger issues.
Thank you. We've got, Kevin and then Andrew.
Yeah, I suppose my biggest struggle is that we put one policy in place that covers every type of river in Otago, when every river in Otago is quite different. So between rivers that are dramatically affected by dry conditions to rivers that have abundant flows all year round, and you're putting the same restriction on all those rivers. So which just doesn't add up to me really. So the rule, the rule doesn't allow the rule doesn't allow the flexibility to look at the river and the flows of those rivers. And I think that's the biggest part that is concerning. And I'm talking especially of rivers that aren't over allocated and they're within well within their allocation limits. And you're putting restrictions on them that are both probably of no environmental advantage and of no have no impact really on the quality of the river that's already there. Which, that's the part that I struggle with.
Thanks, Kevin. We've got Andrew.
When we have a further conversation about this topic, can we also just have some comment from staff around the overall carbon footprint that would relate to the transporting of water via concrete piping regimes? Because I think, Brian's alluded to evaporation. I think we also need to consider the other aspects, positives and negatives.
Thank you, Andrew. Everybody all good? You got any other questions? I've got one question around conveyancing. The conveyancing would like irrigation race. Would they be, that's like a form of conveyancing, isn't it?
They're not an irrigation race is an artificial watercourse, and the direction at the moment only applies to rivers, which excludes those artificial races.
Thank you. I'd quite like to get through the next topic if we can, then we'll have a good break. The next one is in the similar vein, it's around environmental flows, I think.
So Jackie's covering this one.
Elliot had that question from before when we went back to.
Oh, sorry, Elliot.
Climate change.
Oh, sorry, Elliot. Yeah.
Casey, I just sort of want to confirm my understanding, I guess, that in terms of climate change provisions and changes that were after, the only specific changes that they're after were the around STAT's objectives and aligning them with the National Adaptation Plan, and then bringing renewable electricity generation into the IO 10, 5? And yeah, were those the only two changes requested and made around climate change?
Yes, those were the only specific ones that I'm aware of. There might have been others in other chapters that I wasn't looking at, but I'll leave those people to raise those when they speak to theirs.
Other than that, just providing them with that mapping, I guess, of all the other versions, which I think is really good, by the way, and I think we should probably have that somewhere, even as an appendix or something in the plan, just so anyone else who's keen to see how climate change interacts with the plan can just read through that, because that's really good.
Okay, do you have any other questions around climate change? Thank you, Felicity. Move on to number 5.
Sorry, could I just go back to climate change?
Oh, yes, you may give it.
It probably is. and it goes to the mixing of water. So we're saying under, we're to avoid taking water from the Waitaki and taking it over hill and putting it into the Wairika Creek, which does happen now, so that's to be phased out over time. So in an environmental, in a climate change position where the communities need that water into a river over the hill, and we've got an abundant supply on one side, are we saying that in future we will not be able to mix in that way?
I can answer that if you like.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so the cross-mixing issue, which I think is what you're really touching on there, did come up as part of the clause for A feedback, and we had quite a bit of discussion with Mana Whenua on this, and they raised the point that they think the policy was too black and white. So cross-mixing is an issue of concern to Mana Whenua, and that's been identified in the regional policy statement, and we need to give effect to that. So the policy, we are recommending some changes to the policy to make it clearer that the intention is to provide some flexibility for existing cross-mixing. So the example that you quote for an existing situation, it's not an absolute requirement that existing cross-mixing be phased out, and we have recommended some changes to the policy to make that clearer and put some guidance in on when cross-mixing might be appropriate to enable it to continue. And we've tried to recommend some clauses which encourage some engagement with Kaitahu about this, because they've indicated they do appreciate that there are situations where it won't be possible to phase it out. The policy at the moment, as it stands, does require that new cross-mixing is avoided. Happy to reconsider that, but that we do have to be mindful of the regional policy statement and the guidance or the requirement there to address the concern of Mana Whenua about cross-mixing.
Oh, well, somehow I'd like to have that conversation, because in climate change where we have communities relying on water, and if we can't take water from, if we need to augment water for community survival from better water systems, we need to have that available. So I don't know where we have that debate or discussion, but that certainly to me is critical.
Yep, so you're talking about new cross-mixing or new proposals?
But based on climate change and based on the survivability of communities. And look, we looked at that 10 years ago of when Dunedin was 12 years ago when Dunedin was struggling for water. It was actually piping water from the Waitaki through systems right down into Dunedin and then flowing into there. So, and that was for the survivability of Dunedin as such. So, I mean, there may well be other examples. So it seems to me to be critical if all we're hearing about climate change is correct, and I've yet to doubt any of what's being said. So we need to be cognizant of the possible need to do that.
I think we can follow up on that a bit. Iwi is certainly live to that concern, and I think it's a bit like that other one we've just talked about. It's the tension between responding to climate change, but also trying to address other issues like efficiency and in this case cross-mixing. But certainly from iwi there was a willingness to talk about this and see if we can perhaps provide more flexibility. So I'm happy to continue that discussion with them and see if we can go even further than the changes that we've recommended to you today.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
I think Gary's got a follow-up.
Yeah, just carrying on that, what will define existing versus new? So within the proposed plan, if we look at existing systems that are currently using water rivers conduits, which would be Taieri, Lindis, Manihirakia, if they are looking to make changes in their reconsenting processes, does that then become new? So if they're looking to do something different, like, because those catchments possibly all have storage potential changes that are different to what they currently do.
I'm not sure if Joe's still in the room, wants to jump in, but my interpretation is if it's an existing activity and it's got cross-mixing already, it would be an existing activity, and changes to that wouldn't wouldn't flip it to being considered new.
Okay, cool, good.
Thanks, Gary. Andrew?
I'll just follow that up. And if we use the example of the Naseby Township and the Ida Valley is fed by Falls Dam catchment. And if they come in, for instance, a water scheme that predominantly feeds residential activity and probably stock water as well. But if they come in for a resource consent to renew their water permit, they say it was a 35-year water permit or whatever, and they come in, won't they be applying for a non-complying activity?
I'd have to check that. Whether there's cross mixing or not, I don't think affects activity status.
No, you're right. It doesn't impact. So activity status is determined by allocation. I looked at this a few weeks ago. So it's just a policy consideration. Doesn't trigger your pathway. It's the pathway is determined by how much water is available in the catchment, and the cross mixing is just a policy that is considered in your water take application. It is not a rule in itself.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But that example is water going from one catchment out into a new catchment. It's not actually from Falls Dam, but it's from the aquifers that contribute to Falls Dam and to the Manuherikia catchment. That collects water and takes it out into a different catchment. And I thought that was a requirement that iwi weren't comfortable with.
So iwi have a preference to not have cross mixing, but what they've said is it's not black and white. There's not a hard rule about it, and they understand that there are needs, there are things that we need to do, and sometimes cross mixing will be a better outcome than not for the environment and for other things. So it's not a hard and fast, and I think we need to looking at their feedback and having conversations with them, we need to make sure that's clear. But cross mixing in and of itself won't trigger a consent application. It's the actual taking of the water and whether the catchment has allocation available. So if there's allocation available, you'll either be discretionary or non-complying, depending on what it is. And then that policy is one of the policy considerations, like the climate change policy is one of the considerations, like efficiency is one of them, like the environmental outcomes. All of those will be considered together, and that is one of the policies.
I think we've got the words we're practical in here anyway within this cosmic.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you.
Yeah, look, and then therefore that word really does, I understand that, but who actually defines, and I know there is an RMA definition, but who defines where practicable and what boundaries and what limits do we put around that? And if you can just direct me to something, I'm happy to read that, but I mean, can you give me a sort of a brief, who's the, on any one consent, who defines that?
It's not defined in the RMA. I don't know if it's been defined in case law or not. It's used a lot. I don't like it personally, but it is used a lot, and it's used a lot to take in a whole range of factors.
Yeah.
So it's not defined because it's not the same thing all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm just sort of saying, yeah, on the same activity, if we're just moving that cup from there to there and he's moving his cup from there to there, is the same definition used or for where practicable or within the same activity, or do we use it? Can that change within the same activity?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Well,
I think it could change.
We're practical.
It could change over time. So something that's practical in 2 years' time might not be practical right now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's I think that's very important.
That's excellent. Thanks. Everybody will reconvene our workshop. One or two, I'd just come in over the next couple of minutes. So we'll just, I think we're on to number 5. Environmental flows, which I think Sam looks like Sam's in the chair ready to take us away.
I think Jackie's gonna
Oh, Jackie
start
first,
us off
sorry.
and Sam's here to help out.
All good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, this is topic 5. Do the policies and rules in the EFL chapter provide a clear and robust means of phasing out over allocation? It starts on page 14 with the issues that Mana Whenua raised and our recommended response on page 15. So the first issue they raise is there's no clear signal in the plan that a reduction in take will be required for the Manahurukea and Taieri catchments. We agree with that, and there's a couple of places in the plan this could be addressed, and we're recommending that it be addressed in the area specific matters chapter within the FMU sections for each of these rohe. So for the Manahurukea, there's already a policy there, so we recommend that a clause be added that clearly states that long-term limits will be set in the future, and that if that take limit's exceeded, reductions will be required on existing consents in order to get under that take limit. There isn't a policy for the Taieri at the moment, but we recommend that one that's along the same lines as the Manahurukea River be added with a similar clause. So that's how we're going to address that for those 2 rivers. Unless there's any questions, I'll move on to the next question or comment that they had.
Yeah.
Given.
Yeah, so is that going to be based on a percentage of the flow or an actual number?
So for the Manahurukea, there's quite a bit of work still needs to be done to work out what the number should be. So sorry, the short answer is an actual number. And until such time as that number can be determined, so we need to collect a lot more information about what's happening in the river, who's taking what. Until that can be determined, it's recommended that an interim limit be set based on what's currently consented, just simply to stop any further water being taken from the river until that number or that take limit is set.
Yeah, and so I want to debate that actually, because if the flows are either, and this either goes back to your mixing or alternative supplies of water. So if for instance, the Dairy Creek option was bringing water back up into the Manahurukea, or a Falls Dam is reconfigured and existing additional storage made, and the rivers are now, and they're supplying additional water to be above the minimum flows required, why would that water not be available to be taken? So therefore, if you have a number that no matter what additional water gets put in there, you can't take any more. So surely it should be as a percentage of a flow.
Oh, I think we'd have to talk to the scientists about that. I'm not sure that could be done at the moment, but I think if those sorts of changes are occurring, we'd have to look at a change in approach, in the whole approach, I think, for the Manahurukea.
Well, yeah, and that's why I'm saying it needs to be as a percentage, because or a percentage up to the so if you've got a minimum flow, so you've got a minimum flow, so it should be a percentage up to the minimum flow, and then a certain amount over and above that minimum flow. So because a number, look, a flat number discourages from further environmental improvement, so that everyone will be just going to the minimum. We're not allowed to take any more, so why would I? It just sort of restricts.
I mean, I think any proposals for that those sorts of changes or those sorts of enhancements in the catchment could be taken into account for the number that's to be set, the actual number, the actual take limit that's to be set in the future. I think in the here and now, it's difficult to provide for those sorts of situations when we don't know what's proposed or what might be happening.
Well, yeah, but therefore a percentage should be the figure, as opposed to. Yeah, I'd say it should be a percentage of the minimum flow.
Isn't that
okay?
You see what? Yeah,
I do. I'm well outside my technical area of expertise there. That's probably that's not a suggestion that we've had from the science team working on this, but it's perhaps something that can be raised with them to be discussed.
Yeah, well, if they could possibly come back and say why why it has to be a number and not a percentage of the minimum flow.
Yep.
Which might end up being the same blooming thing anyway, but it's just if we're actually putting additional water in for safeguarding that, I'm looking at safeguarding the minimum flow, so you never actually get to that. So I'm looking for an incentive process that will ensure when people do something, they're actually looking above and beyond, as opposed to working to a set figure.
Yeah, I agree. We want to encourage those sorts of solutions.
Thank you.
Said in the law.
Thanks, Kevin, you're happy to get some information back on that?
Yep.
Thank you. Andrew?
There was no comment from, or was there any comment from Manawhenua with regards to the timeframe that, and don't ask me what it is, something will be able to tell me to achieve the minimum flow for the Manuhiri Kia.
2040.
It was 2040?
No, they didn't agree with it. They wanted it quicker. No.
So did they actually mention that?
Yep.
No, I didn't see any comment to that effect in the actual feedback.
Okay, but they haven't got an opinion on either one or another on that.
That's different to what's in the film.
Thanks, Andrew. We got any other questions around the pay? No questions? Well, that's good. So thanks, Jackie. We can move on to the next one, which is
Next one. Yep. So the second issue was that in some catchments, interim take limits have been set based on the current consented allocation in the catchment. So that's where there's not the information available to set an actual number at this point. And they've raised the issue that that approach might not comply with the national policy statement for freshwater, specifically clause 3.174. Now that clause sets out what take limits need to achieve, and it refers to things like providing for flow variability, safeguarding ecosystem health. We agree that setting a take limit at the maximum consented take in the catchment doesn't necessarily meet that. It might in some cases, and we would need technical advice to work out where that's the case. But otherwise, these are intended as interim limits, and in the future, take limits will be determined that do meet the requirements of 3.174 and inserted into the plan. Any questions on that before I move on to the next issue?
Andrew?
Probably more of a comment, and I think that aligns with the lack of scientific data. In some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, and I can't remember the number of science reports, 46 or something tossed around. Some had been completed, and obviously this is another space where we haven't got sufficient data to be able to set a justified flow. So that's their point, where under the pump in terms of time frame.
Sorry, Dick, I was just saying some of that data is some years away, and some, like the Manawhenua Kia, we need to get it in place to enable us to start collecting to then inform take limits down the track.
I didn't quite pick up what Jackie said. Sorry.
Sorry, guys, I can't hear you typing. Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing some people. I'll just turn you up a bit. I was just going to note that some of those catchments are very small catchments where there might only be 1 or 2 users, and so they didn't make the top of the list for research because there's so few users that it's not necessarily the highest priority, and some of that information may come through the consent process from that one applicant or one consent holder in that catchment. But sorry, was there another question there that I just missed?
No, all good. No, I just didn't quite hear what you had said. So no, that's
right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So we all good?
Sorry, it's one important area, and just I wondered for everyone's sake, and I know some people really understand the space, but just a reminder on 101 kind of again on where we're going with allocation limits versus minimum, the fact that we're putting minimum flows in place, but we're working towards allocation limits, particularly in the menu, how that is working. Sorry, it goes back over stuff that I know Andrew knows really well, but yeah, where we're at on that, and then we can we understand our plan better and we can converse with our community if we understand where we're going. So yeah, we've got sorry, if someone can explain again, particularly the Manuherikia, what our approach to flow management and allocation management is.
Do you want me to cover that? Or?
Yeah.
So Manuherikia, there's minimum flows have been proposed based on technical advice, and they're phased over time. Off the top of my head, I think actually I won't quote figures because I don't have them in front of me, but they're phased up to I think 2.5 cubic meters in 2040, I think. Take limit, the catchment is just so confusing in terms of who's taking what conveyance by different water bodies, what's been taken in the summer, what's been taken released for takes below the dam, secondary takes, supplementary takes, that we're not in a position to set a take limit at this point. And so the next plan will go as far as requiring that everything's metered, so that everything is measured and reported back to ORC, including all takes, whether they be primary, secondary, all discharges back into the river, so that the science team can get a much better handle on what's happening in the catchment. And then once that's been done, they can start to work, hopefully with the catchment users, to work out some take limits for both A and B block takes in the catchment. But at this point, there's no take limit set in the plan other than limiting it to what's currently consented and not allowing any new water to be taken. Does that help answer?
That was exactly what I meant. Thanks. Yep, thanks.
Thank you. Kevin?
So at this stage, we're having our best guess, and that we haven't got sufficient signs in a constricted area to back up a limit at this stage.
For the take limit, for minimum flow, we've got enough information, I think, but for the take limit, we just don't know what's happening in the catchment is the problem.
Wow. Thank you.
Just to clarify that we have enough information to justify a limit, right? Just not any specific number.
No.
People don't understand, I think, minimum flow versus take.
So the minimum flow is the minimum amount of water that needs to stay in the river. So we've got sufficient information to set minimum flows in the Manuherikia. Then there's also the question about how much can you take out, which is a different question. And at the moment, we don't have sufficient information to come up with an appropriate volume. So instead of making a guess as to what that volume is what we've done is kept it at what is currently taken, so that people that currently have a consent, when they come in for renewal, they can still apply for that water. And there's a chance that they'll get that water provided it's used efficiently. What iwi have asked for is that there is, though, a clear signal in the plan that that is a holding pattern and that we've got to do more work and that we will set a long-term take limit. So that's what we've done for the Manuherikia.
Yeah, sorry, I do understand that. I just wanted to confirm that that we have enough, scientific information to know that we're going to need a take limit of some description that is, lower than the current take limit. Yeah. Thanks.
Andrew.
Just going back to it's paragraph 45, and which references the NDSFM section that we are able to comply with, and we eventually catch up at some later date. enough information to then sort out what the take limits will be once we've got the additional technical data. Are there any consequences of not being able to comply with that provision of the NPS FM? Is it worded in a way that it says you must, for example, or you may, because there's a big difference. So I just question is, because of our situation, can we actually comply with that particular provision? Don't need to know the answer today, but I think it's a question that government should be aware of.
The approach that we're taking, which is to have an interim limit that doesn't, or that might not give effect to those requirements, is something that we talked through with our legal team as well. So I think that we're quite confident about that at this point in time, that it is that it is appropriate to take this approach. We don't need to give full effect to the NPS-FM immediately.
Yeah, I was just going to add the freshwater visions are kind of the date you're aiming to. So there's always been an expectation that you might not do everything all at once. And so I guess the key thing is setting the signal in the plan that we're still moving forward to get those visions.
Concrete, you got a follow-up?
Yeah, on that, isn't it also to do with the length of your vision, so that your phase, because our water plan's life would be less than the vision for, say, the Manuherikia, so we're phasing it out in that time, but not necessarily in the life of the plan. What else? Would it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
So are those minimum flows and take limits couched with the word where practicable?
No. The minimum flows and take limits are set in an appendix, and the policies and rules reference them. If an existing take's unable to comply with them, it'll trigger a stricter activity status. New takes have to comply with them or they become prohibited. So there's not an extent practicable, but there is room to move, I guess, for existing takes, and that's to allow for that phasing in that it might not be possible the minute the plan goes live for all existing takes to meet the minimum flows and take limits, and that's something that will need to be phased over time. So that's to allow for those consents to get renewed while that phasing in occurs.
Yeah, excellent. So how will that be the effect of those minimum flows on on all our rivers that are having those imposed either as I was going to say made up models, but models that were designed, because some we've only designed the models around non-specifics, and I'm not giving that science, but so how will the section 32 express the constraints on the communities for that? How are we going into, will that come up in the section 32s?
Yes, but before, I'll let Sam jump in there, but before we even get to that, we did look at that and took a pretty long, hard look at some of the more heavily allocated rivers and looked at where it's going to need some phasing. So we looked at the existing situation, existing flows, existing takes, and Sam can speak to this more than me, but there's been some provision for the phasing in so that it's not, we try to be reasonable about how quickly people can adapt to meet new minimum flows and take limits, but I might let Sam pick it up on that.
I'll try to add to that.
Yeah,
so the section 32 report does explore options for how those flows are set and also how they will be implemented, recognising the phased in approach, different timeframes for different catchments, and assess some of the, I guess, benefits and costs of, if you were to do it from day one versus phasing it in over time.
So does that also give us by taking instead of something that if you turn the tap off tomorrow, you could have a flow started, the right flow tomorrow, as opposed to say in 10 years' time? Does that also the section 32 also take and affect the environmental effect of the delay?
It does consider So considers a broad suite of costs and benefits, so it's to the environment, social, economic, cultural costs, so that is covered.
Yep.
And I think it also needs to recognise the proposal for minimum flows. The way they actually work in practice is they have to be implemented as a consent condition. So that's a process in itself.
Yeah.
So if you have an existing water permit, we propose a new flow, even if it is on day one, that doesn't apply to you until just on your consent, either through a replacement consent or through a consent review process.
Or unless you call them all in.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Anything else? I think we continue on. You got
Okay,
more?
we've got two more. So I think I'm on to the third one. Mana Whenua do not support the approach whereby EFLP 3 indicates that interim environmental flows and limits can be changed through a consent process. Yeah, so this is policy 3 in the EFL chapter. This relates to catchments where a minimum flow has been set by the default method and an interim take limit based on that consented rate that we've just talked about is set. The technical advice for some of those catchments was that's a good starting point, but there is room for a more appropriate minimum flow or take limit to be determined on a consent by consent or site by site basis for those. So what the intention of the policy was to set some minimum flows and take limits in the plan as a starter, but allow some flexibility in the consent process if it turns out that there's a better or more appropriate minimum flow and take limit. It wasn't clear that that was the intention, and it looked like we were suggesting that through a consent process you could somehow change the limits in the plan. So we've just we've recommended some changes to EFLP3 just to make that approach clearer. Sorry, it's kind of a bit confusing. I don't know if I explained that clearly, but we are recommending some amendments to address that concern.
Thank you, Jackie. Do you have any questions now? Elliot?
Yeah, I was sort of slightly struggling to understand like how you have a different minimum, or sorry, a different minimum flow on a like consent basis, or like how a minimum flow like applies to a consent, and why that would be different from the existing minimum flow for the river, or I don't know. Yeah, I just didn't quite understand this.
Yeah. So sorry, the question there is how the consent could be different to the plan, sorry, or?
That residual.
Yeah, more.
Perhaps I can provide a bit of a sort of example on how this would be implemented in practice and kind of how it is done currently. So for many catchments in Otago, where there are existing water permits, there are not minimum flows currently. And there's no like flow monitoring site on their catchment. So how it works in practice is through the consenting process. They have conditions imposed that require certain flows are maintained, and that's sort of how it actually plays out in practice.
So would this just be for catchments that don't have an overarching flow?
No.
So they have an overarching minimum flow,
yeah,
but to actually implement that in that catchment, it will be through the consenting process and the setting of like flow conditions, because there is no site to say, you know, when the site's this, you stop taking. So there's an alternative process to actually implement that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are the catchments where there wasn't enough site-specific information to set an actual number based on the attributes of the river and a take limit. And so they've got a default minimum flow and a take limit based on what's currently consented. So it's just allowing that, recognising that there might actually be a more bespoke flow or take limit that's appropriate for that river that might come out of the consent process.
You good there, Elliot?
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I think so.
We'll go to Kevin, we can go back. Kevin?
So I assume that through the because we haven't got the information, we are setting a figure, and as we progress without having a plan change, we see that that figure is not the best figure, and there is room to take more water. We would use that EF to allow us to change that.
This policy doesn't provide for alternative take limits, just for the flows.
Right.
So the flow conditions, and for some of so within this sort of category where this is applying to, some of those catchments are small, few catchments, and some of them are larger, and those are the ones that we anticipate that in the future, possibly plan change may be appropriate. And we also have to, like, for some of them, the consents go out to quite a long time as well, so it's sort of a bit of a balancing act there.
It will be so it's going to be the ability to adjust as the data becomes available, I suppose. That's what you're looking at?
As the data becomes available, as further work is done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
So when you're looking at the alternative environmental flow, are you actually using a sort of estimated MALF? There has to be some sort of calculation that you're using for that. It's not just a guess.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not just a guess. It's so our science has developed a region-wide allocation model that for the catchments where this applied, there's an estimated 7-day, estimated naturalized 7-day MALF where that's the flow if no one was taking water. And that's a combination of model and recorded information to give us the best guess, or sorry, the best estimate.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there are uncertainties for some catchments, and I guess we're more certain for others that it's accurate, but as with any model.
Good there, Tim. Thank you. Kevin again.
Yeah, Tim, I don't think you should be ashamed about using the word guess, because it is a model, but it is an informed decision that you've made. So you probably guess isn't. It's
so long as it's based on
model. It's model. So
It's not a guess.
So it may not actually be. Look, at the end of the day, further, because we haven't been monitoring those sites. As we monitor them, we will refine that. We will refine that figure, and it could, the refinement could go either way depending on the action. So you have to have a start point. So cool.
It's awesome, thank you. Jackie, we're on to our last one, I think.
Last one we are, shouldn't take long. So the fourth one was about takes at higher flows, or what the plan is referring to as B blocks. And they just said that the provisions for determining or for taking at high flow need to be clearer. And Mana Whenua would like to understand better how that high flow take has been determined. In terms of making it clearer, we agree with that. So the kind of the method for working out B block take limits and minimum flows was sort of written into the policy, and it was quite confusing. So we're recommending some general streamlining to the policy, but also removing the clauses that try to explain how it's calculated and rewrite that as a method that sits separately to the policy. In terms of helping Mana Whenua to be able to understand how it's been determined, there was a technical report that informed this policy or this approach. So that'll be made available to them or to everybody, and then along with explanation in the Section 32 report to explain the rationale behind this approach. And that's it from me. If there are any questions on that.
Thank you, Jackie. Do you have questions?
I reckon I asked them to ask you to do that.
It was a good idea.
Well, that's excellent. Thanks very much, Jackie. It's been a good session there.
Thank you.
And, good participation, so that's all good. So we're going to number 6, which is the primary production check bill, which is going to be a name change, I believe. Who's in charge of this one? Will be
That's me.
Oh,
Yeah. From water quantity, I guess, moving on to water quality. You come back with a general concern there, which is something that was raised earlier about a gap. Their concern is that a lot of the provisions in our plan for managing water quality, particularly under the primary production chapter, they're basically about holding the line. And where we want to seek some improvements, it's primarily done or encouraged through freshwater farm plans and non-regulatory actions. They've also raised the fact that that is something that has been picked up as well, that potential management gap has been picked up in our science reports. And so they're not quite clear how we're going to fill that gap. They've suggested some amendments. One of them was to include phased pathways for achieving the targets through the provisions in the primary production chapter, predominantly where we see that happening in the graded catchments. They also want a little bit more clarity in the policy framework around how the non-regulatory and the regulatory limbs are going to work together to achieve the targets. And then they wanted some include some provision for additional requirements for activities that are taking place in heavily degraded catchments. So with regard to that first requested amendment to have phased pathways, we looked at that, but it's a really difficult thing for us to do. And at this point, we actually lack the technical information to come up with a clear phased pathway. We know that there's a gap between what the plan is going to achieve and what will be what is required to be achieved under the environmental outcomes for some FMUs or for some parts of various FMUs and ROHE. But we've also said previously that those outcomes and those target attribute states, they need to be achieved by a combination of our plan mechanisms as well as freshwater farm plans and the action plans which will be embedded in the catchment action plans. So it is really about looking how those three tools are going to work together to get us towards achieving the outcomes. At the moment, we cannot quantify what the gap will be once all those tools are in place. So in the short answer to that is we're going to have to be adaptive in the way we manage and maintain our plan. So keep monitoring the outcomes and when necessary, update our plan through a plan change and put in additional regulatory tools if necessary to kind of get us there over time. So we think there's we cannot provide phased pathways at the moment. I do have to say that we have set interim targets as well. So we've got some that's not articulated in the paper, but we do have some goalposts in the middle that give us something to work towards under this plan, because they're set for a 10-year time frame.
Thanks, Tom. Kevin?
I understood that within our FMU particular targets, that there was, there was wording that said we had to be moving within bands at certain particular times to get to our target, or that the actions we were taking, I thought there was the flexibility that you're talking about already written in there, that if we weren't moving towards a target over a certain period of time, that we would then look at plan changes or interventions to ensure that that was happening. I thought we already had that written in there. Because when I'm just thinking particularly of the North of Target one, where someone moving from, we're only moving from Ds to Cs and say E. coli, but it had to be shown, the trend had to be going in the right direction.
Yeah.
I thought we had that written in there, Tom.
I think that's why we have it.
It will be on these tables.
Yeah.
Yeah. So have we not? Isn't that not the phasing that they're asking for? We not.
Implicitly, that is already bedded in through the interim targets.
Yeah,
where we have a reversing trend. The interim targets are set to a degrading trend. The interim targets are set to kind of reverse that degrading trend.
Yeah.
So that's in there.
Yeah, it's just about making that explicit rather than having to get through the
dive into it to find it. Yeah. Cool. So we're not really changing anything. We're just gonna
just making it clear to
making it
people who are reading it.
Yeah,
so they
yeah,
don't
cool.
have to,
Thank you.
Thank you. I got Andrew's in.
Doesn't the catchment context challenge values action plan? Because once you've got an action plan, talking about pathways, surely that also reinforces where the work's gonna happen to improve environmental outcomes. In this case, we're talking about water quality. So isn't that also a pretty direct action that's required? And there, because your farm plans are audited, etc. Does that not also just reinforce where mana whenua believe there's a gap? Maybe. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I just feel that exists for a reason. And the reason being is that you then target the areas that need to improve water quality for whatever action, and that will fall out of the action plan. So as a catchment, collectively, you're sort of all heading in the right direction to get the best outcome.
Yeah, I guess the advice that we've got is that, well, no, that's not right. At this point, we're not sure whether that will be enough or not, and yeah, so it'll definitely take us away, but until those are implemented, we just don't really have the information to say if that's or not.
So when you say if those are implemented, are you referring to farm plans? Those?
Well, the actions
the
and
whole- the
the
whole
whole package, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, I see,
Yeah.
okay.
Brian.
Yeah, it's not necessarily helpful because we talked about it before, but anyway. The tables there, going about these, some of them might say an improving trend. I find it frustrating, like, for example, there's one here, Menahira Care at Ophir, which gets a certain amount of press on a water quantity basis, and the water quality for phosphorus, the baseline is C. The 2034 interim target is to maintain C. And the 2040 interim target is not applicable. So just a little bit of feedback, I mean, I know all the rhetoric around the plan, but I find that difficult to understand. Except.
Thanks, Brian.
Well, because how do you get scientific sort of, this, it's almost as if science is non-approachable on this. Science.
Yeah, it is tricky to kind of interpret these things. The NPSFM kind of requires us to present them in a certain manner as well. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've heard Jason say is it's quite difficult to move within a band, let alone up a band. And so we've got to allow people time to do that thing, and we can't just expect everybody to change what they're doing tomorrow. So I know you mentioned before about them not being
Up to
ambitious.
2040, and the same to maintain.
Yeah.
The same.
Yeah, but that also, community aspirations dictate whether it's maintained or improved, and all the requirement is maintain up to the bottom line.
Are you
So that is
suggesting
the
to me that the
requirement.
community aspiration is to maintain it at sea? Is that what
Potentially, yeah, potentially, yeah,
Well, not the community that I'm part of.
yeah, well, and that's what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Here is the issue.
Sorry, because, don't want to get into a debate, but can we just go, and we've got a scientist on the other side of the table, and I'm not a scientist, but we've talked about the lag period it takes to turn around these things, and I think when it comes to phosphorus, they talk about 15 years or something like that. So,
Well, 20, 40, 15 years.
well, yeah.
And
So all I'm trying to say, these things take time. They don't happen overnight, and I think those tables reflect that.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Really gotta be really careful just picking out individual numbers here and there.
Yeah.
But,
I'll give us more if you want.
The process, yeah. That's all good, thanks. Awesome. Do you have any other questions on that? think you've got another couple of bits in here.
Yeah.
Time to go.
The second amendment was to ensure that the policy framework explains how regulatory and non-regulatory tools work together. We've got a few policies that already refer to both, but really what we think is the appropriate place to kind of bring that story is actually the Section 32 report. So the Section 32 report will, in a number of places, kind of acknowledge that gap and kind of explain the predicament in which we found ourselves and how we're trying to deal with closing that gap over time. Yeah, and unless there's any questions around that, the third amendment they requested was to provide for additional consent requirements in heavily degraded catchments. And again, like we did previously for climate change and with the permitted activity conditions, we kind of did a bit of an audit, really. And what we found is like there's quite a few policies that actually do that, except instead of referring to heavily degraded catchments, which talks about the current state, we're kind of looking at the outcomes, what the future state would be. So they won't necessarily refer to like a catchment being heavily degraded. It's more about reminding them where people need to go. And so those policies, they drive people where there's a big gap between the current situation and where they need to go to put in an extra effort. I won't take you through them, but they're listed on paragraphs 53 till 57.
Thanks. Thank you, Tom. Do you have questions? No questions, stage.
Thank you. And yeah, that's the end of my topic.
So under 56 IPP 16, so where it says relevant environmental outcomes, that will be the relevant environmental outcomes particular to that FMU.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. And around the timeframes and everything that's specifically in there. Yeah. Good. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Kevin. Do we have any other questions? That's all we got. Thank you, Tom. Let's see here. We got 2 to go.
Sorry, looks good. Sorry.
Yeah, carry on.
Back to paragraph 51. And our answer to Mana Whenua is that is in that paragraph and it references, as you've just said, section 32. But section 32 won't be a regulatory tool. Once the plan is notified, it's a tool as part of the process. So I'm just wondering, I'm not completely satisfied Mana Whenua, because I understand the question. I understand we need to be heading in the same direction when it comes to non-reg and reg. I understand that. But yeah, I just thought that reference is slightly out of left field. But
the reason that one of the things that hearing panels will do is if we're saying we're not going to ask the plan to do all the work, we're going to ask some non-regulatory stuff to do all the work, we need to justify that in terms of the section 32. So that comment is around saying that we want the two things to work hand in hand. The section 32 outlines why perhaps a more stringent rule-based approach isn't the most efficient and effective, because it's partnered with a non-regulatory approach that's funded and planned and underway.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you for that. Cheers.
Thank you.
So is that's explaining that gap. Cool. Yep.
All good. We move on to number 7.
Yeah.
Green
So this
dams.
Danny and Tim gonna.
Tim?
Thank you.
Kia ora. So this section, which starts on page 18, is relevant to both the dam and bed chapters. So I'll provide a quick overview of the key matters raised in the feedback, and then I'll hand over to Danny, who will take you through the staff responses and recommendations. So the key feedback from Mana Whenua included concerns that the chapters rely on permitted activity conditions to manage the effects of activities, rather than through a consent process where the policy direction will be considered. There is limited protection for the habitats of Indigenous species that are not threatened species. And they're also concerned that the linkage between the chapters and the environmental outcomes wasn't clear. So in terms of recommendations, they were to review all the permitted activity conditions against the environmental outcomes in the plan, just to check that they covered all the relevant effects. Include limits on permitted activities to ensure consent is required in some of those sensitive locations and for the larger scale activities. And to remove permitted activity provision for activities with potentially significant effects on the benthic environment or the natural form of water bodies. And they highlighted examples such as suction dredging and sediment traps as well.
Cool, thanks Tim. So in response to those, I guess those concerns and the recommendations put forward by iwi, in terms of the permitted activity conditions and providing that sort of line of sight between permitted activity conditions and the environmental outcomes, the values and the associated attributes and criteria, we have reviewed both the policy direction and the permitted activities in the bed, dam and flood chapters. And we consider that as a package, they, alongside the strategic direction in the IM chapter, address an appropriate range of effects based on the environmental outcomes. You'll see at the end of the document, there's Appendix 1, and Appendix 1 includes a table that kind of sets out for each chapter which of the relevant environmental outcomes apply. And so that's been done not only for the bed and dam chapters, but also for the other chapters in the plan, the other activity-specific chapters in the plan. Iwi also had a few kind of specific comments on a couple of the policy provisions in both the bed and dam chapters to better ensure that those environmental outcomes are captured. And we've made a couple of amendments to a few policies to better address effects on water quality and the Indigenous species that they've mentioned. In relation to managing permitted activities in sensitive locations and for those larger scale activities, again, we've done a bit of a sense check of the permitted activity conditions across the relevant chapters. And we consider that in all cases, they provide either limits on scale, which are either explicit. So for the likes of some of those small structures, mai-mais, whitebait stands, that kind of thing, there are clear limits on the scale, the size of those structures that can be put in as a permitted activity. In other cases, the limit on scale is likely to be a bit more implicit, whereby larger scale activities are unlikely to be able to comply with the permitted activities. So it's not an area limit as such, but it's likely that larger scale activities wouldn't be able to comply with the permitted activity conditions and therefore would trigger a consent requirement. The majority of the permitted activity conditions also include limits on the types of activities that can occur within or near sensitive sites, including habitats of threatened species, Mataitai, Taipure, Nohoaka at the request of iwi through the Clause 4A feedback, and drinking water protection zones. As I think Tom mentioned earlier in the workshop, those permitted activity conditions haven't been applied as standard across all of the bed, dam and flood provisions. There has been a bit of an activity-specific lens applied, particularly for those activities that we want to enable where they're likely to provide for, I guess, environmental improvement. We've also, where are we? In terms of the permitted activities that may have potentially significant effects on the benthic environment, suction dredging and sediment traps being mentioned by name there by iwi. We've again reviewed the permitted activity provisions for those activities, and at this stage we are happy that the permitted activity conditions appropriately manage the adverse effects of those activities. For suction dredge mining in particular, we've had some technical advice that supports the permitted activity limits that have been established. And for sediment traps, an approach has been adopted that's fairly similar to the one taken through Plan Change 8 a few years back. There's also been a few other minor amendments to the bed chapter in light of the iwi feedback, including correcting some numbering errors and improving the wording in some policies to try and clarify the intent. And you'll see those detailed in the table in part B of the response. But that's it for these chapters. So if you've got any questions, happy to hear them.
Thank you, Danielle. It's good, very good summary. Any questions? Andrew?
That's more of a perhaps a question for Anita, but sensitive sites, have we actually got a schedule?
Not a question for me.
I assume when clause 4 went out, there was a schedule somewhere of sensitive sites.
Yeah, I can talk to that if you like. So for all of the permitted activities, all of the conditions that refer to sensitive sites, so drinking water protection zones and the likes, all of those I'm fairly sure are mapped or identified through schedules appended to the plan, so that there is certainty for those permitted activity conditions.
Excellent, very good. Yep. And my other query was just around sediment traps, and you referenced plan change 8. So in plan change 8 was, sorry, I'm going a little bit beyond what's in front of us, but in plan change 8 was there a permitted activity status for sediment trap activity?
Yeah, there was a permitted activity provision for sediment traps. Some of the conditions have changed slightly through the land and water plan, but the sort of general intent is the same.
So permitted activity to establish one and a permitted activity to operate or manage one, or manage one of those.
I'm not sure what the scope of the PCA, I can't remember off the top of my head what the scope of the PCA rule was in terms of the kind of difference between establishing and the sort of ongoing use and operation. But through the land and water plan, we've kind of created 2 very clear permitted activity rules, one for the establishment and then a second for the ongoing use and maintenance of the sediment trap, given there is a requirement to actively maintain them to make sure that they're functioning properly.
Clearly, Manawa had concerns about management of them, appropriate management going forward, but you've made those based on technical data that you've had in relation to those various activities that you listed, suction, dredging, et cetera.
Yeah. So at this stage, we are comfortable with those permitted activity conditions, but I think we may have flagged in the response in part B that we are open to suggestions on how we might be able to otherwise manage those activities through submissions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think if you go back to your plan change 8, this one it's far clearer than what plan change 8 was, is probably a little bit more enabling. Yeah. Well, that's the way I read it anyway. Any other questions? That's very good. Thank you very much. Alex,
I mean, I can kind of assume the reasons, but I just want to confirm what the reasons for just having those restrictions between August and April were.
For the suction dredge mining activities. Yep, so that was intended to kind of capture the key fish spawning periods that would be avoided.
Yeah, I got that. Yeah, cool, thanks.
Good, thank you. That's all really good. Thanks very much. So thank you, Danielle and Tom, for that. And we've got on to number 8, which is wastewater.
Tom.
Which is Tom.
Yeah, and Amber, you might help out with some of the questions potentially. Basically, with wastewater, they had 2 concerns. One was there's currently a rule for discharges of wastewater from reticulated systems to water, and that assigns that activity a non-complying activity status. You're saying, well, you're treating untreated and treated wastewater in the same way. You should actually make untreated wastewater discharges to water prohibited. That was our first concern. Amber looked at that, but considered that it's actually better to manage it through requiring consent as a non-complying activity status. If it's prohibited, you can't really manage it. And some types of discharges of untreated wastewater are unavoidable, like wastewater overflows. By making it prohibited, you kind of lose control. Whereas if you require a consent, you can require the operators to put in place actions or strategies to reduce that risk. Their second concern was around management or the lack of management of cumulative effects of on-site wastewater systems, so septic tanks. And basically the recommendation there is to amend the policy. That's policy WWP5. Include another clause that when there is a proposal to have multiple dwellings serviced by on-site wastewater systems, to actually include in the application some evidence that shows that on-site wastewater systems are more effective than a reticulated system in that circumstance. And that's basically yeah, an overview of their feedback and our response. Happy for myself or Amber to take questions.
Thank you, Tom. Ingrid?
And I remember this discussion at one of our workshops, and I was trying to think at the time a scenario of where you would have untreated wastewater being discharged into a water body, and it's just finally worked it out. So if you take the Dunedin reticulated network, it's got to travel from the source to the treatment plant, but on the way it might travel through kilometres and kilometres of pipe. So that's the scenario we're looking at, rather than, because I think when we had that workshop, I kept thinking, well, why have we actually got this situation? Are we just talking about random discharges here, there and everywhere? But it's really when it's being transported before it gets treated is the main reason to have the ability to deal with it. I think that's, sorry, once again, I'm getting slightly off. Manapena was concerned, but just to clarify my own mind.
Yeah, that's right. So in Dunedin, for example, there are actually constructed wetweed overflows because to stop the wastewater from going back into people's houses in a severe weather event, there are in fact outlets where that untreated wastewater will be discharged probably to a stream in order for it to stay away from people's houses. That is hopefully being phased out and storage solutions being put in, but it is still a practice which is occurring. So that's an example of those untreated overflows going into water.
So the only real solution, practical solution, is storage somewhere in the transportation system, pipe network. To cater for those in those flood event type situations.
That's right. And so we don't think that the staff recommendation is not to prohibit those, because then you've got a sort of a court scenario, sort of legal avenue that immediately has to happen, whereas by consenting, we can work with those operators to progressively reduce those instances from occurring.
I've got Kevin then Brian.
Oh, Brian.
Brian first, pardon, please.
Just rereading or something.
You didn't have your red light on, Brian.
Yeah, but I don't have a red light on to speak or to get your attention. A couple of points. The first one is I don't know if that's entirely correct, that the only option to avoid overflow situation is to get storage. That's what Andrew put on board. I mean, my understanding, for example, the Kokra stream is that they're looking at overflow piping situations to the treatment plant, or you could overflow it to land, in all these situations. And I challenge what you said too, Tom, that it was unavoidable. It's not unavoidable. It's just there's not a will or a budget to do it. And as was said before, they are being phased out. So they are avoidable. It comes down to the time, and it's not all about storage. Make that point.
The rules reflect that, though. It says minimise the But progressively reduce the frequency and volume of wet weather overflows.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just challenging what was said.
Yeah.
And can I just ask here and now, what the understanding is, you know, in relation to if you're establishing a new reticulated wastewater system? Because there's a lot of angst with this, you know, I get emails, there's mayors, all this stuff. Whereas my understanding is that we avoid direct discharges to water, and we're talking about sewage, and that we're requiring either land-based or a design treatment system or a wetland constructed to treat contaminants. And that we could do either of the three.
So I might take this one because I've spoken about it a lot in the last month. So what the plan is going to do is differentiate between existing systems and new systems.
Yes.
So the existing systems, as Gretchen just pointed out, is that continued improvement. So the expectations are you get better and better over time, and you show that. And then for new systems, then the preference will discharge to land, but there's not a prohibition on discharge to water. So if discharge to water is better than discharge to land, and as part of that continued improvement, then there's a pathway for them to get a consent.
Yeah, but I'm only reading what's written here.
And it's not as clear as it could be here, so that we are fixing that so it's a bit clearer.
Okay, so I think that will remove a lot of the angst that seems to be, you know, central government even. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Kevin?
Yeah, just, is there time on this? Like, you certainly put timeframes on when this has got, you say progressively, and all that sort of stuff. You actually haven't got a, like all FMUs have got to reach a target by a certain date and everything, but we've got no, because is it because it's urban, we don't have the.
No, but they'll be subject to the same timeframes as the freshwater vision, so that
Oh,
will
you're talking about
dictate.
space? Yeah, because it's
So
part-
whatever
yeah,
FMU
yeah,
they're in
yeah,
will
yeah.
dictate in terms of what, that depends what they apply for and.
Yeah,
But
that
they're
would
also
become the
required to
overarching.
contribute.
Yeah, good, yeah, thank you.
Gretchen?
Yeah, can I ask the one that still everyone gets confused about, which is the avoiding direct discharges to water? Yeah, we might as well ask it.
So that was the one that councillor Scott just
Oh,
referred to.
sorry,
That I said
yeah.
isn't as clear as it should be.
Oh, sorry,
So
I was
we're
not
making
listening enough.
No, that's okay. I
Yeah.
just saw him pointing at it, so I knew which one.
No,
he was
no, you can
talking
still
to.
answer the question though.
So it's, but it's the answer I just gave you in terms of making that policy clear that there's not an absolute prohibition on new discharges to water. But there is a high bar. There are high expectations in terms of when that would be an option that's available.
It was avoiding the same as where practicable. It's a different definition.
Yeah, quite different.
How different?
Avoid says don't do it, where practical says unless there's no other option that's reasonably available to you. So it won't look exactly like you're seeing it now when you get the version in October.
So the section 32 report to the minister will take into account the new proposed wording that you've just articulated.
Well,
yeah?
I haven't articulated what the wording is because I'm not the one holding the pen, but yeah, it will.
And so between now and 5 days' time, the section 32 report will take that into account.
The section 32 won't be ready in 5 days' time, but the report to the minister will acknowledge the situation as I've just set it out.
Okay, thank you very much.
So what will the new wording be?
Yeah, ask it again.
I can't tell you what the new wording will be because I'm not, because the team is still working on it, but it will be clearer.
Could you give an example of what it might be?
Well, it might say avoid where practicable, I don't know. But it could do.
Excellent. Right.
That's Andrew. You have it.
Can we go back? Sorry.
Can you go back to the word avoid? We've no longer got, let's talk about new wastewater treatment discharge. We go back to the original plan, we're going to prohibit that activity by 2045. Now it's a non-complying activity, and as you step down through the various directions, you start off with number one is avoid discharge into a water body. So on the basis of the RMA definition of void, what sort of are you able to give some examples, practical examples, and maybe as Brian's alluded to in section 32, then maybe some commentary in there that could give some practical examples. But are you able to share a practical example of where you could actually get through that first gateway test?
Or,
It's a pretty
sorry,
hard
is it also to do with the definition of direct discharge are we overthinking that one?
So
what does it mean?
Yeah, so there's two things. That's not what it's going to look like, because that would sort of line up with a.
You're not going to take the word
activity.
out of void.
No, a straight avoid won't be. I'm sorry, I don't know what the policy.
Yeah.
Amber may be better to speak to what the policy direction is going to say. I don't want to put her on the spot because we're still working on it. If it was a straight avoid, you'd be looking probably at a prohibited activity status. The courts are reasonably clear on that. There's been a bit of a softening through some of the more recent Court of Appeal stuff. There is a pathway, the non-complying activity. So the policy direction needs to match the non-complying activity for new discharges to water. So that's the process that the team are working through, just to make sure that that's clear. In terms of practical examples, I probably can't give you any in a public session.
I was trying to understand what would be the impediments or hurdles to get over, to get through the test. So, for example, let's say you had no available land that was suitable to discharge treated wastewater to, for example. That would probably be a bit of a showstopper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand in Queenstown that is some of the challenges that they have in terms of the land doesn't have the ability to absorb.
You might have the land, but it may not have the suitable soil.
Exactly.
For example.
It can't assimilate the wastewater. Yep. So, the option might be to treat it to a high standard and then discharge it, rather than, putting it to land where it's going to, have overland flow and run off and end up worse off.
And another example could be that the treatment proposed was to such a high standard that it was to a drinkable state, for example, what happens in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Couldn't that? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
So just.
But having said that, that may not be where it ends up, like having it to a drinkable standard.
No, but if we're going to have a rule to ask applicants, if the first step is to avoid, so they're obviously going to think about what are the other options for me here?
Yeah.
And I was just trying to, we're going to send them down a different pathway.
Yeah.
Because we want to avoid discharge to a water body. So they're going to think about alternatives and be innovative in thinking about alternatives.
Yeah.
And that would be a good thing, eh?
Yeah.
So a classic example of this would be, we had a site visit to the Wanaka sewage treatment plant.
Project Pure. Yeah.
Yep. And so they were discharging the water, treated water, onto paddocks around that site. And the material waste was being trucked down to Lumsden, I think, and being spread over the land. Is that the ideal sort of scenario that we're wanting to achieve through this?
I'm not a wastewater engineer. I don't know what's an ideal scenario, but that's a good outcome. Yeah.
Well, the same thing happens at Moriki. Gets down to the Cardigan Strait.
But that's what this is encouraging, isn't it?
Yeah, so when somebody mentioned an example to me recently where you might have a community on septic tanks, so it's currently discharging to land, and the TA might put in a reticulated system that treats and then discharges to water. That might actually have lesser effect than all of the individual septic tanks. It just depends. It depends on where and what and how.
It's good discussion. It's not a touch points, isn't it? So it's good to get a little bit of clarity of where the intention is for it to head towards. Thanks, Christian.
Sorry, to labour this one, I'm still a little bit confused, just Yeah, I thought there was some discussion around the definition of what either wastewater or discharge means, so that when it says avoid it, depending on what the definition of that, it's not a straight avoid of everything, including really high treated wastewater. So maybe I'm wrong on that, because we just did have a discussion that it does mean avoid all situations of all treated types of wastewater. So I just, if you could outline that, that'd be
Yeah,
good.
so you're right in that the definition of wastewater from the planning standards is any two of, and then it lists industrial, trade. I can't remember, sewage, greywater, sewage, and so we thought that using that word was clear. It's not clear enough, that's why we want to make further changes.
Yeah,
That was our
okay.
first
We initially thought
take,
that.
is that, it was sort of language, but I think we need to go further than that. That term is not helpful in
Right.
this situation.
Okay, good to know,
Yeah.
So it's still the so a mana whenua then happy that if we are treating it to the right standard to put it into water?
I don't think that we can speak for mana whenua, but they understand that there are practical constraints that may mean a discharge to water is preferable to a discharge to land.
Yeah. So
And this is a balance. This is.
yeah,
your
no, I understand.
plan.
Yeah. No, I'm really happy that, so I suppose my question is that where is the test of practicality done? And one of our biggest constraints in the RMA process is the cost of getting to that consent and proving those sorts of restrictions. You know, is it practical? So how much do I have to go through to design something to show that it's not practical? So where are all those tests outlined?
So, I've just forgot, there's a schedule to the RMA in terms of consenting that requires a consideration of alternatives. So they have to demonstrate, for any application, they have to demonstrate to a level that's commensurate with the scale of the effects. That it's, you know, we've tried, we've looked, the land doesn't assimilate, or actually we're putting in a higher treatment system or a couple of settling ponds, whatever it is.
33 kilometres
yeah,
away.
whatever it is.
Yeah, commensurate. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. Final
Good discussion.
sort of thing.
You don't want to end up in the poo here, Gretchen.
Yeah, well, I'm worried that we might end up in the poo, but the king salmon, really.
Yeah.
This is gonna go, because it will go to Supreme Court if we go on avoid where practicable or something like that. It's avoid with a rider is gonna be impossible, I think.
So
So
the team will draft a solution that is consistent with the law, but that provides the limited pathway that we've talked about. I don't know what it is.
yeah, it might not be avoid.
It might not.
It might, yeah, I think,
That's the key.
Yeah.
That's the word.
Yeah.
The same for everybody.
Avoid.
Well, funny enough though, for a target decision, like
Yeah.
you said, it
Does
does
it?
give an out. If there's no alternative,
Yeah.
if you cannot operate a port, a commercial port safely with navigational requirements and all that, you can't maintain your lights and navigational infrastructure in the harbour. You've got to carry out those sorts of things, otherwise you essentially can't you can't operate. So there are situations being since King Salmon that's probably given an out. So you apply that to wastewater.
Although that's a really unique set of circumstances under the NZCPS in terms of balancing those two avoid policies, and now you just can't look at the first word, you've got to look at the whole sentence.
I guess
that
I was
was-
trying to socialise for your help that if we don't have avoid, we understand why.
I'm quite happy for it not to be there.
Yeah.
No, no.
Yeah, but there's strength in it. Yeah, that's isn't it?
Elliot, did you have something?
That, because avoid to me sounds like, don't do it unless you have to anyways, and that's what we're going for, but that's clearly not the legal definition, and that's the problem, and so we're just gonna find the right
Yes.
word, but we all kind of understand what the meaning is we're going after.
Yeah.
So that's.
Yeah.
Sounds good, and trust you guys to find those words. Good luck.
Oh, that's excellent. Have we got any other? That's been a pretty good discussion, mate. It's been very, very worthwhile. Any other questions? We got, as you're all aware, there's a table at the bottom that sets up a few of the individual specifics, and I think probably if anybody's got any particular concern about any of the particular wording, they could probably do that on more a one-to-one with Flo, most likely. So, but other than that, I think it's been pretty good session. We've covered a few of the touch points, and we've certainly got a pretty good feel for the Manawhinawa's feedback and how we've approached it and incorporated it into how we intend to incorporate it into a plan where we see it adds to our plan, and how we can communicate back with Manawhinawa if we believe that their concerns are already covered within the plan. So I think it's been very good session, so thank you very much. So thank you very much to the team online at Insight as well, if you're still there. Thank you for the top table. And thank you once again to all the councillors for it's been another good session. We've all been able to have our say, get your questions out, and have a little bit of debate without getting too far off track. So that was really good. So thank you very much. So I'll just close the session.
Can I just make one comment, just to look back to Councillor Martin's comment earlier, so 22nd of November 2022, we took a paper to council.
Yep.
To do that submission that said.
I remember it.
Yep. So just closing that outside tells us we might not get everywhere we need to go across there.
It's awesome. Thanks very much. I'll just close with my little wee code here, which goes Aor, ki te aorangi, Aor, ki te whenua, Aor ngā mea katoa. Peace to the sky, peace to the land, peace to all things.
Well done, Lloyd.
Thank you. Thank you.